Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The dispatch came through at 11:47 p.m., crackling with static that made Greta Hollins lean forward in her chair and adjust her headset. She'd been working the graveyard shift at the Cascade County Emergency Communications Center for 6 years, and she knew the difference between normal radio interference and something that felt wrong. This felt wrong. The caller's voice was male, middle-aged, breathing hard like he'd been running. He reported an abandoned vehicle on Route 47, about 15 miles north of Great Falls, near the turnoff to the old mining access road that hardly anyone used anymore. No hazard lights, no driver visible, just a dark pickup truck sitting sideways across the northbound lane with the driver's door hanging open. Greta typed the details into the system while keeping her voice steady and professional, asking the standard questions. The caller said he'd slowed down, flashed his high beams, even honked, but got no response. He didn't want to approach the vehicle himself. Something about the way it sat there in the darkness made him uneasy, he said, and Greta didn't blame him. Route 47 was desolate this time of night. Nothing but pine forest and rocky outcrops stretching for miles in either direction. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, and if someone was out there on foot, they wouldn't last long. She assured the caller that an officer was being dispatched and took his contact information in case they needed a follow-up statement. After he disconnected, she sat for a moment looking at the screen, then keyed her radio. Unit 12, this is dispatch. We've got an abandoned vehicle reported on Route 47, approximately mile marker 43. Dark-colored pickup, driver's door open, no occupant visible. Caller expressed concern. Can you respond? The radio hissed for 3 seconds before Officer Warren Pike's voice came through, rough and tired but alert. He'd been patrolling the Eastern District, dealing with the usual Friday night nonsense. Drunk college kids trying to drive home. A domestic disturbance that turned out to be neighbors arguing about a barking dog. The kind of calls that made him wonder why he'd stayed in law enforcement for 19 years. But an abandoned vehicle in the middle of nowhere, that was different. That had the potential to be something real. He confirmed he was en route and estimated arrival in 20 minutes. Greta updated the call log and settled back to wait, but something nagged at her. She pulled up the location on the mapping system and zoomed in, studying the terrain. Route 47 cut through some of the most isolated country in Montana, and that particular stretch was known for spotty cell reception and the occasional elk crossing that caused accidents. The old mining road that branched off nearby had been closed for decades, ever since the copper operation shut down in the 70s, leaving behind a network of tunnels and rusted equipment that the forest had slowly reclaimed. Local teenagers sometimes used it as a party spot in the summer, but in March, with snow still piled in the shadows and ice coating the back roads, no one went up there. She made a note in the system about the mining road's proximity, just in case it became relevant. Warren's headlights cut through the darkness as he drove north, the center line of Route 47 unspooling beneath him like a yellow ribbon. The heater in his patrol unit struggled against the cold, and he could see his breath misting faintly in the air despite the vents blasting warm air toward his face. The radio played softly, a country station out of Great Falls, but he turned it down as he approached mile marker 40, scanning the road ahead. The forest pressed close on both sides, dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir creating walls of shadow that his headlights couldn't penetrate. He'd worked this area long enough to know every curve and straightaway, every spot where deer liked to leap out at the worst possible moment, and he felt the familiar tension that came with responding to an unknown situation. At mile marker 43, his headlights swept across the pickup truck, and Warren immediately understood why the caller had felt uneasy. The vehicle sat at an odd angle, nose pointed toward the shoulder but rear end still blocking half the northbound lane, like the driver had started to pull over and then just stopped. It was a late 90s Chevy Silverado, dark blue or maybe black under the dirt and road salt, with Montana plates and a rifle rack visible in the rear window. The driver's door stood wide open, the interior light long since timed out, leaving the cab dark and empty. Warren activated his light bar and pulled to a stop 30 feet behind the truck, positioning his vehicle to protect the scene from any northbound traffic, though he doubted anyone else would be coming through tonight. He radioed his arrival to dispatch and stepped out into the cold, his breath immediately forming clouds in the frigid air. The silence was immense, broken only by the idle of his engine and the faint creak of frozen tree branches swaying in the wind. Warren approached the Silverado with his flashlight raised, the beam cutting through the darkness and illuminating the truck's interior. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. A thermos sat in the cup holder, and a work jacket lay crumpled on the passenger seat. The floor mats were tracked with mud and pine needles, and there was a faint smell of coffee and cigarette smoke lingering in the cab. Everything looked normal, mundane even, except for the fact that the driver had apparently gotten out and walked away into the night without closing the door. Warren circled the vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, playing his flashlight over the ground. He found footprints almost immediately, work boots, size 10 or 11, heading away from the driver's side and moving toward the tree line on the western shoulder. The prints were clear in the thin layer of snow that dusted the ground, and they didn't waver or stumble. Whoever had left them had walked with purpose, not like someone disoriented or injured. Warren followed the tracks for 20 feet, watching as they led straight into the forest, then stopped at the edge where the trees became too dense for his light to penetrate effectively. He stood there for a long moment listening, but heard nothing except the wind and his own heartbeat. Back at the truck, Warren ran the plates through dispatch. Greta's voice came back within minutes with the registration information. The Silverado belonged to Reuben Castle, 47 years old, address in Choteau, about 50 miles northwest. No warrants, no criminal history, nothing that raised red flags. Warren looked at the photo on file, a weathered face with graying hair and a cautious smile. The kind of man you'd see at a hardware store or a diner and never think twice about. He checked the cab again, this time more carefully, looking for anything that might explain why Reuben Castle had abandoned his truck in the middle of Route 47 and walked into the forest on one of the coldest nights of the year. That's when Warren noticed the radio. It was an old CB unit mounted under the dashboard with the microphone hanging from a coiled cord. The power light was off, which made sense since the ignition was turned off, but Warren found himself staring at it anyway. Something about it felt significant, though he couldn't articulate why. He climbed into the driver's seat, careful not to disturb anything, and turned the key one click to accessory power. The dashboard lights flickered on, and so did the CB radio, its digital display glowing green in the darkness. Warren picked up the microphone and keyed it experimentally, listening to the squelch break across the emergency channel he had it set to. Nothing unusual happened. The radio functioned normally, picking up a faint conversation from what sounded like truckers on I-15, miles to the south. Warren was about to turn everything off when he noticed the channel selector had been moved. The CB was set to channel 19, the standard trucker channel, but there were faint scratches on the dial like someone had been adjusting it repeatedly. Acting on instinct, Warren started scanning through the channels slowly, listening to the hiss of static and the occasional burst of distant voices. Most channels were empty, just the white noise of unused frequencies. He was about to give up when he hit Channel 9, the emergency channel, and heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a voice, distant and distorted, barely audible through layers of static, but it was saying his name. "Warren," the voice said, stretched and hollow like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Warren, can you hear me?" He nearly dropped the microphone. His hand trembled as he keyed the radio, his throat suddenly dry. "This is Officer Pike with Cascade County Sheriff. Who is this? Identify yourself." The static surged, and for a moment there was nothing. Then the voice came back. Clearer this time, but still wrong somehow. Still distorted in a way that made Warren's skin crawl. "It's cold out here, Warren. So cold. I can't find my way back." Warren's training took over, pushing down the fear that wanted to rise in his chest. "State your name and location. Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" But the voice didn't answer his questions. Instead, it said something that made Warren's heart hammer against his ribs. "I'm by the truck. Why can't you see me?" Warren spun in his seat, his flashlight sweeping across the interior of the truck, then out through the windows into the darkness beyond. There was nothing there, just the empty road and the wall of trees and his own patrol unit with its lights still flashing. "There's no one here," Warren said into the radio, his voice harder now, demanding. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" The voice on the radio laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "Check the woods, Warren. Check the old mine road. That's where I went. That's where I always go." And then the transmission cut off, leaving only static. Warren sat in the driver's seat of Reuben Castle's truck, his breath coming fast now, his mind racing. The voice had sounded male, roughly the right age to match Reuben's description, but there was something off about it. Something that didn't quite fit. He tried keying the radio again, cycling through channels, but got nothing except empty frequencies and the occasional trucker conversation far to the south. The voice was gone. He climbed out of the truck and radioed dispatch, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Greta, I'm going to need backup out here and probably search and rescue. The registered owner is Reuben Castle, and I've got footprints leading into the woods on the western side. There's also..." He paused, unsure how to explain what had just happened. "There's evidence suggesting he may have gone up the old mining access road. I'm going to check it out, but I want someone else en route." Greta's response was immediate and professional, confirming that she was contacting the on-call search and rescue coordinator and that another unit was being dispatched from Choteau. Warren retrieved a more powerful flashlight from his patrol unit along with his jacket and gloves, preparing for a hike into the woods. But before he left, he leaned into the Silverado one more time and looked at the CB radio. The green display still glowed in the darkness, showing Channel 9. As he watched, the channel suddenly changed by itself, the numbers flickering through frequencies until they stopped on Channel 16. Warren's hand moved to his service weapon, a reflex born from 19 years of expecting the unexpected. Then, as he stood there in the cold with his heart pounding and his breath misting in the air, the radio crackled to life one more time. "I can see you now, Warren," the voice said, and this time it sounded like it was right behind him. Warren spun around so fast he nearly lost his footing on the icy gravel, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the darkness behind him. There was nothing there, just his patrol unit with its light bar still rotating, casting red and blue shadows across the empty road and the wall of trees beyond. His hand was on his weapon now, thumb resting on the safety, every nerve in his body screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this situation. The radio in Reuben Castle's truck hissed with static, the voice gone as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the ambient noise of an open channel and Warren's own ragged breathing. He backed away from the Silverado slowly, keeping his flashlight moving, scanning the tree line and the shadows between the vehicles. 19 years on the job had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct was telling him that he was being watched. The temperature seemed to have dropped even further, if that was possible, and the wind had picked up, causing the pine branches overhead to creak and sway. Warren reached for his shoulder radio, needing to hear Greta's voice, needing the connection to the dispatch center and the world of procedures and protocols that made sense. Dispatch Unit 12. I need that backup expedited. Something's not right out here. Greta's response came immediately, her professionalism a lifeline in the darkness. Copy that, Unit 12. Unit 7 is approximately 12 minutes from your location. Search and Rescue Coordinator has been notified and is assembling a team. Do you need me to stay on the line with you? Warren considered it, then decided against it. He needed to maintain radio discipline, needed to keep the channel clear for when backup arrived. Negative, dispatch. I'm going to do a preliminary search of the immediate area. Will advise. He released the radio key and stood there for a moment, gathering himself, forcing his breathing to slow and his mind to clear. The footprints leading into the woods were still there, still clear in the thin snow, and Warren knew he should follow them. That was procedure. A man was missing in sub-freezing temperatures, and every minute counted. But the voice on the radio had mentioned the old mine road, and that was accessible by vehicle if you knew where to find the turnoff. Warren made a decision, moving back to his patrol unit and climbing into the driver's seat. He would check the mine road first, quickly, and if he found nothing, he'd return and follow the tracks on foot. It made tactical sense, he told himself, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he was avoiding the woods because he was afraid of what he might find there. The turnoff to the mining access road was 3/10 of a mile north, barely visible even when you knew where to look. Warren almost missed it despite his familiarity with the area, the old Forest Service sign so faded and overgrown that his headlights swept right past it the first time. He backed up and turned onto what had once been a graded road, but was now little more than 2 parallel ruts winding up into the hills. The patrol unit's suspension protested as he navigated over frozen puddles and exposed rocks, branches scraping against the sides with a sound like fingernails on metal. The road climbed steadily, switching back twice before leveling out onto a plateau where the old mining operation had been situated. Warren had been up here a few times over the years, usually chasing reports of teenagers partying or transients camping in the abandoned structures. The main shaft entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel grating decades ago, but the support buildings remained: a collapsed equipment shed, the skeletal remains of a processing facility, and a small office building with most of its windows broken out and its roof sagging dangerously. In summer, the place had a melancholy, post-industrial beauty to it, but in the dead of winter night, it looked like something from a nightmare. Warren's headlights illuminated the scene in harsh white light, casting long shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. He parked near the old office building and stepped out, his flashlight in hand and his breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. The wind was stronger up here, whistling through the broken windows and the gaps in the structures, creating sounds that could have been voices if you let your imagination run. Warren called out, his voice carrying across the empty plateau. "Reuben Castle, this is the Cascade County Sheriff's Department. If you can hear me, make yourself known." The words echoed off the buildings and died in the darkness, and no response came back except the wind. Warren began a systematic search of the area, checking each structure carefully but quickly, aware that time was critical if Reuben was out here somewhere. The equipment the shed was empty except for rusted machinery and the nests of pack rats. The processing facility was too dangerous to enter. Its floor partially collapsed and its walls leaning at angles that suggested imminent failure. That left the office building, and Warren approached it with caution, his flashlight beam preceding him through the empty door frame where a door had once hung. The interior was a mess of broken furniture, scattered paperwork turned to pulp by years of weather exposure, and graffiti covering every available surface. Warren was about to leave, convinced that no one had been here recently when his flashlight beam caught something that made him stop. In the far corner of what had been the main office, someone had cleared away the debris to create a small space. There was a sleeping bag, relatively new, and several empty food containers. A camping stove sat next to a pile of firewood, and hanging from a nail on the wall was a jacket that looked exactly like the one Warren had seen on the passenger seat of Reuben Castle's truck. He moved closer, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon again, and that's when he saw the photographs. They were spread across the floor in a rough circle, maybe 20 or 30 of them, all showing the same location from different angles. Warren crouched down to examine them more closely, and his stomach tightened as he recognized Route 47 and the exact spot where Reuben's truck now sat abandoned. But these photos hadn't been taken tonight. The lighting was different, and in several of them Warren could see other vehicles passing by, their shapes blurred with motion. What made his skin crawl was that someone had drawn on the photographs with red marker, circling specific details: the tree line, the mile marker, the angle of the road, and on the back of each photo, written in cramped handwriting, was a date and time. Warren pulled out his phone and started photographing the scene, documenting everything for the investigation that was clearly becoming more complicated by the minute. As he worked, he noticed something else. On the wall behind where the photographs had been laid out, someone had written directly on the concrete in what looked like charcoal or burned wood. The writing was dense, filling nearly the entire wall, and as Warren read it, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a log, a detailed account of observations, and it mentioned Route 47 over and over again. But what disturbed Warren most was the signature at the bottom, written large and deliberate: Officer W. Pike, Cascade County Sheriff. His hands were shaking as he took photographs of the wall, his mind racing through possibilities and explanations that all felt inadequate. Someone was either impersonating him or had an obsession with him, and that someone appeared to be Reuben Castle. But why? Warren had never heard that name before tonight, had no memory of any interaction with the man. He pulled out his phone, intending to call this in immediately, but saw that he had no signal. The remote location and the terrain were blocking any cellular service, leaving him isolated and increasingly uncomfortable with his situation. Warren was backing toward the door, still photographing the scene, when his shoulder radio crackled to life. It was Greta, her voice distorted by static but understandable. Unit 12, be advised that Unit 7 has arrived at your location on Route 47. Officer requesting your status. Warren pressed the transmit button, relief flooding through him at the knowledge that backup had arrived. Dispatch Unit 12, I'm up at the old mining site. Tell Unit 7 to hold position at the truck. I've found evidence that requires immediate documentation. We'll return to their location in approximately 10 minutes. But before Greta could respond, another voice cut through the transmission. The same hollow, distorted voice Warren had heard on the CB radio. Don't leave yet, Warren. You haven't seen the best part. Warren spun toward the wall, where he'd been photographing the writing, and his flashlight beam caught something he'd missed before. Behind the sleeping bag, partially hidden in shadow, was a doorway he hadn't noticed. It led to what must have been a back office or storage room, and from that doorway came a faint, flickering light that hadn't been there moments before. Every instinct screamed at Warren to leave immediately, to get back to his vehicle and drive down to where his backup was waiting. but he was a police officer, and a man was missing, and that light could mean Reuben Castle was in that back room, possibly injured and needing help. Warren drew his weapon, holding it in a proper grip alongside his flashlight, and moved toward the doorway. "Reuben Castle, this is the police. I'm coming in. If you're in there, identify yourself." His voice was steady and commanding, the voice he'd used 1,000 times before to assert control over uncertain situations. The back room was smaller than the main office, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a single broken window that looked out onto the darkness beyond the mining site. The flickering light was coming from several candles arranged in a circle on the floor, their flames dancing in the draft from the broken window. And in the center of that circle, lying face down with his arms spread wide, was a man wearing work clothes and boots that matched the description of Reuben Castle. Warren's training took over completely now, his fear pushed aside by the immediate need to assess and respond. He approached quickly but carefully, checking the corners of the room first to ensure no one else was present, then holstering his weapon and kneeling beside the prone figure. Warren reached out to check for a pulse, his fingers finding the man's neck, and was shocked when he felt warmth and a steady heartbeat. "Sir, can you hear me? This is the police. You're safe now." The man didn't respond, didn't move, and Warren began a quick assessment, checking for injuries or signs of trauma. There was no blood, no obvious wounds, no indication of what might have caused him to be unconscious. Warren keyed his shoulder radio again, calling for immediate medical response, his training overriding the strangeness of the situation. He needed to get this man help, needed to get him down to the road where the ambulance could reach them. As Warren was preparing to move the unconscious man into a recovery position, his flashlight beam swept across the wall behind the circle of candles, and he saw more writing. This was different from the log in the main room, less organized and more frantic, the words overlapping and spiraling across the concrete. Warren's blood ran cold as he read them, because they weren't dated in the past. They were dated in the future. Tomorrow's date, next week's date, dates stretching forward into March and April and May. And next to each date was a description of events that hadn't happened yet, written in that same cramped handwriting. March 14th. Officer Pike responds to accident on Route 47. Finds his own vehicle. March 21st. Officer Pike receives call about missing person. Discovers he is the missing person. Warren was still staring at the wall, his mind trying to process what he was seeing, when the man on the floor moved. It wasn't the slow, gradual movement of someone regaining consciousness. It was sudden and violent, the man's head snapping up and his eyes opening to stare directly at Warren. But those eyes were wrong, the pupils too dilated, the whites shot through with red, and when the man spoke, his voice was the same distorted, hollow sound Warren had heard on the radio. "Hello, Warren. I've been waiting for you. We've been waiting for you." The man's mouth moved, but the timing was slightly off, like a badly dubbed film, and Warren realized with growing horror that the voice wasn't coming from the man's throat. Warren scrambled backward, his hand going for his weapon again, but the man on the floor didn't pursue him. Instead, he sat up slowly, cross-legged within the circle of candles, his head tilting at an angle that looked anatomically impossible. "You don't remember me, do you?" the hollow voice said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Route 47, October 12, 2003. You were driving north, late shift, tired from a double. I was driving south, trying to get home to my wife in Choteau. Do you remember?" Warren's mind raced back through the years, trying to find the memory, and then it hit him with the force of a physical blow. October 2003, 22 years ago, when he was new to the force and still learning the roads. He'd been exhausted after working 16 hours straight, covering for a sick colleague, and he'd drifted over the center line for just a second on a curve. There had been headlights, a horn blaring, the sickening crunch of metal, and then darkness. Warren had woken up in the hospital 3 days later with a concussion and a broken collarbone. The other driver hadn't been so lucky. The report had said he died at the scene, but Warren had been cleared of any wrongdoing. The investigation determined that the other driver had been speeding and that the accident was unavoidable given the road conditions and visibility. Reuben Castle, Warren whispered, the name finally connecting to a face he'd tried to forget for more than 2 decades. You died in that crash. The man in the circle nodded slowly, that terrible smile spreading across his face. I did, but I never left. I've been here, Warren, on this road, in these woods, in this mine, waiting and watching and learning. And now you're going to understand what it's like to be stuck in one moment forever, to be trapped in the place where everything ended. The candles flared suddenly, their flames shooting up a foot high, and Warren felt the temperature in the room drop so quickly that frost began forming on the walls. Warren's radio crackled with Greta's voice, urgent now and worried. Unit 12, Unit 7 reports they can see your vehicle at the mine site, but you're not responding to horn signals. What's your status? Warren grabbed for his radio, pressing the transmit button, but the only sound that came out was static mixed with that hollow, distorted laughter. He ran for the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he fled the office building and sprinted toward his patrol unit. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, slow and steady, and that voice calling out, "You can't leave, Warren. You're already here. You've always been here." Warren reached his vehicle and threw himself inside, slamming the door and jamming the key into the ignition. The engine turned over immediately, and he threw the transmission into reverse, backing away from the office building so fast that his tires spun on the frozen ground. In his rearview mirror, he could see a figure standing in the doorway of the building, illuminated by the taillights, watching him leave. But as Warren looked closer, squinting through the darkness, he realized with mounting terror that the figure wasn't Reuben Castle. It was himself, wearing his uniform, his equipment belt, his badge, standing there with that same hollow smile on his face. Warren didn't slow down until he reached Route 47, his patrol unit fishtailing as he turned onto the paved road. Unit 7 was there. Officer Mendoza, leaning against the hood of his vehicle, and Warren had never been so glad to see another human being in his entire life. He practically fell out of his vehicle, his legs shaky and his hands trembling, and Mendoza immediately moved toward him with concern on his face. "Pike, what the hell happened up there? You look like you've seen a ghost." Warren wanted to laugh at the accuracy of that statement, but instead he just shook his head and tried to get his breathing under control. "Radio isn't working right," Warren managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Need to call this in directly to Greta. We've got a situation up at the mine and it's—" He paused, trying to find words that would make sense, that wouldn't make him sound completely insane. "It's complicated. We need more units, and we need to seal off this entire area." Mendoza was already reaching for his radio, but before he could key it, both their radios crackled to life simultaneously. It was Greta's voice, but she sounded confused and distressed. "All units, please be advised. We're receiving multiple 911 calls about an officer down on Route 47, mile marker 43. Callers report a sheriff's vehicle in the ditch with an unresponsive officer inside. All available units respond immediately." Warren and Mendoza looked at each other, then turned to look at Reuben Castle's abandoned Silverado, still sitting where Warren had found it with the driver's door open. And there, pulled off onto the shoulder just beyond it, was another Cascade County Sheriff's Patrol unit, its light bar dark and its front end nose down into the shallow ditch. Warren felt his knees go weak because he recognized that unit. The number on the roof, visible in Mendoza's headlights, was Unit 12. His unit. But his unit was right here, parked on the road behind him, the engine still ticking as it cooled. Warren turned slowly, looking at his own patrol vehicle, and saw that the roof number was different. It read Unit 12A, a designation that didn't exist in their department. Mendoza was already running toward the vehicle in the ditch, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and Warren forced himself to follow, even though every fiber of his being was screaming at him to run the other direction. As they approached, Warren could see through the windshield that there was indeed someone in the driver's seat, slumped over the steering wheel. Mendoza reached the driver's door first and pulled it open, then immediately recoiled, his flashlight falling from his hand. Jesus Christ, Pike, it's you. It's you in there. Warren looked into the vehicle and saw his own face staring back at him, his own body wearing his own uniform. But the eyes were vacant and lifeless, and there was no rise and fall of breath in the chest. Warren heard himself talking, heard the words coming out of his mouth as he radioed for additional units and medical response. But it was like he was operating on autopilot, his conscious mind unable to fully process what he was seeing. Mendoza was asking him questions, demanding explanations, but Warren had none to give. He could only stand there in the cold, watching as more units arrived and the scene filled with flashing lights and radio chatter, and wonder if the thing he'd met in the office building at the mine was right. Maybe he'd never left Route 47. Maybe he'd been here all along, trapped in this moment, living and reliving the night that Reuben Castle's ghost came looking for closure. As the ambulance arrived and the paramedics began working on the body in the ditch, Warren walked back to his vehicle, the one marked Unit 12A that shouldn't exist, and sat in the driver's seat. He picked up the CB microphone from Reuben's truck, which he'd taken as evidence, and turned it on. The radio was set to Channel 9, and as Warren keyed the microphone, he heard his own voice coming back to him through the speaker, distant and distorted and hollow. "Warren," his voice said from somewhere else, somewhere in the past, or the future, or the eternal present of Route 47. "Warren, can you hear me? It's cold out here, so cold I can't find my way back." The Cascade County Sheriff's Department administrative building was fluorescent bright and aggressively normal when Warren walked through its doors at 6:47 a.m., exactly 7 hours after he'd first responded to the call about an abandoned vehicle on Route 47. The normalcy felt like an assault after what he'd experienced. The harsh lighting and the smell of burnt coffee, and the sound of keyboards clicking seeming to belong to a different world entirely. Warren had driven back in silence, following Mendoza's unit, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel of the patrol vehicle that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. Unit 12A. Every time he glanced at the dashboard or caught sight of the vehicle number in his mirrors, his stomach twisted with a sick feeling that went beyond simple fear. Sheriff Mackenzie was waiting in her office, her expression grave but controlled. She was a compact woman in her late 50s who'd worked her way up through the ranks over 30 years, and Warren had always respected her ability to remain calm under pressure. But even she looked shaken as she gestured for Warren and Mendoza to sit down, closing the door behind them and drawing the blinds on the interior windows that looked out onto the bullpen. "I've read Mendoza's initial report," she said without preamble, settling into her chair and fixing Warren with a steady gaze. "Now, I need to hear it from you, Pike, all of it. And I need you to know that nothing you say leaves this room unless you want it to." Warren took a deep breath and began talking, laying out the events of the night in chronological order. The abandoned Silverado, the footprints leading into the woods, the voice on the CB radio that knew his name. His decision to check the old mining site, finding the camping setup with the photographs and the writing on the wall. The unconscious man who turned out to be Reuben Castle, or something wearing Reuben Castle's face. The predictions written on the wall, dated in the future. And finally, the discovery of his own body in Unit 12, slumped over the steering wheel in the ditch, while he somehow stood there breathing and alive in a vehicle that bore a designation their department didn't use. Sheriff Mackenzie listened without interrupting, her fingers steepled in front of her face, and when Warren finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mendoza shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Warren could feel the weight of his colleague's uncertainty. They'd worked together for 5 years, but this was beyond anything either of them had trained for. Finally, the sheriff spoke, her voice measured and careful. The body that was recovered from the vehicle in the ditch has been transported to the county medical examiner. Preliminary identification confirms it matches your physical description, Pike, including a scar on your left forearm from that fence accident in 2019 and a tattoo on your right shoulder. Fingerprints are being processed now. Warren felt the room tilt slightly, his vision narrowing at the edges. He looked down at his left forearm and pushed up his sleeve, revealing the thin white line where he'd torn his arm open on barbed wire while pursuing a suspect. The scar was there, exactly as it should be. He'd gotten the tattoo, a simple compass rose, after his daughter was born, a reminder to always find his way home to his family. That was on his right shoulder, hidden beneath his uniform. "That's impossible," Warren said, but his voice lacked conviction because nothing about the last 7 hours had been possible, and yet all of it had happened. "The vehicle you drove back in," Sheriff Mackenzie continued, pulling out a file and opening it on her desk, "is registered to this department, but you're right that we don't use the A designation. According to our records, Unit 12A was decommissioned in 2004 after being totaled in a collision. The vehicle was sold for scrap, and the designation was retired." She turned the file toward Warren, and he found himself looking at photographs of a patrol unit, twisted metal and shattered glass, being loaded onto a flatbed truck. The date stamp on the photos read October 14th, 2003, 2 days after his accident with Reuben Castle. Warren's hands began to shake, and he clasped them together tightly to keep the tremor from showing. "The accident I was in," he said slowly, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. "The one with Reuben Castle. That was Unit 12A, wasn't it?" The sheriff nodded, her expression sympathetic but also deeply concerned. "You were driving that vehicle when you crossed the center line. The collision totaled both vehicles. Castle died at the scene. You were airlifted to Great Falls and spent 3 days in ICU. The Accident Review Board cleared you of negligence, determined it was unavoidable given the circumstances. Road conditions, visibility, fatigue." Mendoza was looking between them, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand. If that vehicle was scrapped 22 years ago, how did Pike drive it back here tonight? And how is there a body in Unit 12 that looks exactly like him?" Those were the questions that mattered, the ones that cut through all the supernatural impossibility and demanded answers that the rational world couldn't provide. Warren found himself thinking about the wall at the mine, the predictions written in that cramped handwriting. March 14th, March 21st. Dates that hadn't happened yet but somehow had already been recorded. Sheriff Mackenzie stood up and moved to her window, looking out over the parking lot where the morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. "I've been doing this job for 30 years, she said quietly. "And I've learned that there are some things we can't explain. We can document them, we can investigate them, but we can't always understand them. What I need to know, Pike, is whether you're fit for duty, whether you can continue working, or whether you need time to process what happened. Warren thought about that question, really thought about it, and realized he didn't know the answer. Part of him wanted to turn in his badge right now, walk away from Route 47 and the old mine and the impossible things he'd seen, and never look back. But another part of him, the part that had been a cop for 19 years, knew that walking away wouldn't solve anything. If he was somehow trapped in a loop, if the thing wearing Reuben Castle's face was right about him never leaving that night in 2003, then running wouldn't help. He needed to understand what was happening, needed to find a way to break whatever cycle he'd fallen into. "I need to go back," Warren said. And even he was surprised by the certainty in his voice. "To the mine. There's something there, something connected to Castle and to me and to that accident. The writing on the wall, those predictions, they're not random. They're showing me something, warning me about something. I need to understand what." Sheriff Mackenzie turned from the window and Warren could see the conflict in her expression. She was his commanding officer, responsible for his safety and the safety of the public. But she was also a woman who'd seen enough inexplicable things in her career to know that sometimes the rule book didn't apply. "If you go back," she said slowly, "you don't go alone. Mendoza goes with you, and I want you both wired for audio and video. Everything gets recorded. I'm also contacting a specialist, someone who's consulted with law enforcement on unusual cases before. She should be able to meet you at the site by noon." Warren nodded, accepting the conditions, and stood up to leave. But before he reached the door, the sheriff called him back. "Pike, one more thing. The medical examiner called about 20 minutes ago. The body from the ditch, the one that looks like you, it's been dead for approximately 22 years. Carbon dating of the tissue, decomposition patterns, everything points to it dying in 2003. But it looks fresh, like it died last night." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and undeniable, and Warren felt something shift in his understanding of reality. He wasn't dealing with a ghost or a haunting in the traditional sense. This was something else, something that bent the rules of time and space and life and death. He thought again about the voice on the radio, his own voice, saying he was cold and couldn't find his way back. Maybe he'd never made it out of that collision in 2003. Maybe everything since then. His recovery, his career, his daughter being born, all of it had been some kind of echo, a possibility that existed parallel to the reality where he'd died with Reuben Castle on Route 47. Warren left the sheriff's office and walked through the bullpen, aware of the other officers watching him with expressions that ranged from concern to curiosity to barely concealed suspicion. News traveled fast in a small department, and by now, everyone knew something strange had happened on Route 47. He stopped at his desk and sat down, pulling up his computer and doing something he probably should have done hours ago. He searched the department database for Reuben Castle, looking for any connection between them beyond the accident in 2003. What he found made his blood run cold. There were 7 entries, 7 separate incidents where Reuben Castle's name appeared in reports, and all of them were dated after his death. A noise complaint from his address in Choteau in 2007, filed by neighbors who reported hearing someone moving around in the vacant house. A welfare check in 2011, requested by a postal worker who'd seen someone matching Castle's description at the property. 3 separate calls to 911 in 2015, 2017, and 2019, all reporting an abandoned vehicle on Route 47 near mile marker 43, all describing a dark blue Silverado with the driver's door open and no occupant visible. Warren printed the reports and spread them across his desk, looking for patterns, for anything that might explain what was happening. The most recent call before last night had been in August 2023, just 8 months ago, and the responding officer had been Deputy Hargrove, who'd since retired and moved to Florida. Warren pulled up Hargrove's contact information and made a note to call him later. If anyone else had experienced what Warren had experienced last night, it would help to know he wasn't losing his mind. Though at this point, Warren thought grimly, losing his mind might actually be the preferable explanation. Mendoza appeared at his desk, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and set one down in front of Warren. "Sheriff says we roll out at 11:30, meet this specialist at the mine at noon." I pulled the topographical maps and the old mining company blueprints from county archives. Thought we might want to know the layout before we go back in. Warren nodded gratefully and took the coffee, the warmth of the cup grounding him in the present moment. Mendoza was a good cop, steady and thorough, and Warren was glad to have him as backup. "Thanks. Did you manage to get any sleep?" Mendoza shook his head, dropping into the chair at the neighboring desk. "Couldn't. Kept thinking about what we saw. That body in the ditch, Pike. I've seen dead bodies before, plenty of them, but that one... There was something wrong with it beyond just the fact that it was you. The eyes were open, and I swear they followed me when I moved around the vehicle. And when the paramedics were loading it onto the stretcher, I heard it whisper something." Warren set his coffee down carefully, his full attention on Mendoza now. "What did it say?" "It said, he's still in the mine. He never left." Mendoza's voice was barely above a whisper, and Warren could see the fear in his colleague's eyes. "Pike, what if going back there is exactly what this thing wants? What if we're walking into some kind of trap?" It was a valid question, one that Warren had been asking himself since he'd fled the office building in terror. But he kept coming back to the writing on the wall, to those predictions of future events. If something was trying to trap him, why warn him? Why show him what was coming? Warren pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos from the mine, zooming in on the images of the wall writing. The predictions were specific and detailed, not vague prophecies but concrete descriptions of events. March 14th. Officer Pike responds to accident on Route 47, finds his own vehicle. That was 3 weeks away. March 21st. Officer Pike receives call about missing person, discovers he is the missing person. 4 weeks. The pattern suggested that whatever was happening would escalate, that Warren would be drawn back to Route 47 again and again until something resolved, or until he became permanently trapped there, like Reuben Castle. Greta appeared from the dispatch center, her expression worried, and Warren waved her over. She'd been on shift all night, should have gone home hours ago, but she'd stayed to make sure Warren was all right. "I've been reviewing the 911 recordings," she said without preamble, pulling up a tablet and queuing up an audio file. "The initial call about the abandoned vehicle, the one that sent you out there. I want you to listen to something." She hit play, and Warren heard the caller's voice, the middle-aged man who'd reported seeing Reuben's truck on the side of the road. But as Warren listened more carefully, as Greta had obviously done, he realized something was off about the voice. It had the same hollow quality, the same slight distortion, as the voice he'd heard on the CB radio, and when the caller gave his contact information, the phone number he provided was disconnected, according to the records Greta had pulled. The call came from a prepaid cell phone, purchased in Great Falls in 2003 and reported lost in the same year. Greta said quietly, "Pike, I think something called us, used our own system to draw you out to that location." Warren felt the pieces clicking together, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than anything he'd imagined. This wasn't random. This was targeted, deliberate, a trap that had been set specifically for him. Reuben Castle, or whatever remained of him, had been planning this for years, leaving traces in the system, appearing at the same location over and over, waiting for the right moment. And last night, for reasons Warren didn't yet understand, had been that moment. The question was why? Why now, after 22 years? What had changed? Warren was still pondering that question when his phone rang, an unknown number showing on the screen. He almost didn't answer it, but something made him pick up, some instinct that this call was important. "Officer Pike," he said, and heard static on the other end, the familiar hiss of an open radio channel. Then a voice came through, distorted and hollow but unmistakably his own. "Warren, I need you to listen carefully. You're running out of time. The loop is closing, and soon there won't be any difference between the you that died and the you that lived. You need to go back to the mine, find the main shaft, and go down. That's where it started, and that's where it has to end." "Who is this?" Warren demanded, even though he knew the answer. "What do you want from me?" The voice on the phone laughed, that same sound like wind through broken glass. "I'm you, Warren. The version of you that didn't survive the accident. The one that's been stuck on Route 47 for 22 years, watching you live the life I should have had. But the thing is, there is no difference anymore. We're converging, all the versions of that night, all the possible outcomes. Soon we'll all be stuck there together, in the moment of impact, forever. Unless you can break the loop." The call disconnected, leaving Warren staring at his phone with his heart pounding. Mendoza and Greta were both looking at him with concern, and Warren realized he must look as shaken as he felt. "Change of plans," Warren said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "We're going back now. I don't think we can wait until noon." Sheriff Mackenzie emerged from her office, having apparently heard the urgency in Warren's voice, and for a moment Warren thought she would order him to stand down, to wait for backup and the specialist. But instead she just nodded once, a sharp gesture of acceptance. "Keep your radios on. Keep recording everything, and if things go sideways, you get out immediately," she said. "That's an order, Pike. Whatever's happening out there, we can't help you if you're dead." Warren agreed, though part of him wondered if dead was a relevant concept anymore. If the boundary between life and death hadn't already become so blurred that it didn't matter which side he was on. He collected his gear, made sure his body camera was functioning, and headed for the parking lot with Mendoza close behind. The patrol vehicle, marked Unit 12A, was still there, sitting in its assigned space like it had never been anything unusual. In the morning light, Warren could see details he'd missed in the darkness. There were scratches on the driver's door that matched the ones in the accident photos from 2003, a small dent in the front quarter panel, and when Warren opened the door and looked at the odometer, it read 47,243 miles, the exact same number that had been recorded when the vehicle was totaled 22 years ago. It hadn't moved, hadn't aged, hadn't accumulated a single additional mile despite Warren driving it back to the station from Route 47. Mendoza noticed it too, his expression grim. "This is wrong, Pike. All of this is wrong. Vehicles don't come back from being scrapped. Dead men don't make phone calls. We're dealing with something that doesn't follow the rules." Warren climbed into the driver's seat, feeling the familiar contours of the seat, the steering wheel, the controls. It felt right in a way that was deeply unsettling, like coming home to a place he'd never left. "I know," Warren said quietly, "but the only way through is forward. Whatever's waiting for us at that mine, whatever Reuben Castle has become, it's connected to me and to what happened in 2003. And I think it's been trying to tell me something all along." They drove north on Route 47, the morning sun bright and clear, making the road look almost cheerful. But as they approached mile marker 43, Warren felt the temperature drop inside the vehicle, despite the heater running full blast. Reuben's Silverado was gone, towed away as evidence, but the spot where it had sat was still visible, the gravel disturbed and tire tracks clear in the dirt. Warren slowed down, something pulling at his attention, and that's when he saw them. Footprints, dozens of them, all leading from the road into the woods. But these weren't the single set of tracks he'd followed last night. These were overlapping and crisscrossing like many people had walked this path, or one person had walked it many times. Warren and Mendoza got out of their vehicles. Mendoza had followed in his own unit, and approached the tree line with their flashlights drawn despite the daylight. The footprints continued into the forest, clearer now in the snow that had fallen overnight, and they all appeared to be the same size and pattern. Work boots, size 10 or 11, the same ones Warren had tracked last night. But the sheer number of them was impossible. It would have taken hours, days even, for one person to make this many tracks. Unless time worked differently here, Warren thought. Unless past and present and future were all happening simultaneously in this place. "We follow them," Warren said, making the decision before he could second-guess himself. "All the way to the mine if that's where they lead. But we stay together, and at the first sign of anything that feels wrong, we pull back. Agreed?" Mendoza nodded, though Warren could see the reluctance in his colleague's face. They were both scared, and that was probably the most rational response to what they were walking into. But they were also cops, trained to walk toward danger rather than away from it, and that training overrode their fear. The tracks led them through the forest on a winding path that gradually climbed toward the plateau where the old mining operation sat. But as they walked, Warren began to notice something strange. The trees around them looked wrong, their branches bare despite it being early March when the first buds should be appearing, and the light filtering through the canopy had an odd quality to it, somehow both bright and dim at the same time, casting shadows that moved against the wind. Mendoza saw it too, his hand moving to his weapon, and Warren realized they were crossing some kind of threshold, moving from the normal world into whatever space Reuben Cassel inhabited. They emerged onto the plateau, and Warren stopped so suddenly that Mendoza nearly walked into him. The mining site had changed. The buildings were still there, still abandoned and decrepit, but now there were more of them, structures that hadn't existed last night or in any of the historical photos Warren had seen. And surrounding the entire site, arranged in a perfect circle, were vehicles. Patrol cars, all of them marked Unit 12A, all of them empty with their doors hanging open and their light bars dark. Warren counted them slowly, his voice barely a whisper. 19. There are 19 units here. One for each year since the accident, Mendoza said, understanding dawning in his voice. Pike, how many times have you been called out to this location? How many times have you responded to reports about Route 47? Warren tried to remember, tried to count all the calls over the years, but his memory seemed to slip and slide, moments blurring together. Had he been here before? More than once? How many times had he driven up this road, searched these buildings, found nothing and left, only to forget it had ever happened? The office building where Warren had found Reuben last night stood at the center of the circle of vehicles, and as they approached it, Warren could see that the door was open, light spilling out from inside despite there being no electricity in the abandoned structure. He could hear voices too, multiple voices, all talking at once, and as he got closer he realized with a sick feeling that they were all his voice, variations of himself speaking over each other, arguing and pleading and crying out. Mendoza grabbed his arm, trying to hold him back, but Warren pulled free gently but firmly. "I have to go in," Warren said. "This is what I came for, what I've always been coming for." He stepped through the doorway into the light, and everything changed. He wasn't in the abandoned office anymore. He was sitting in Unit 12A, driving north on Route 47, exhausted from a double shift, and in his headlights he could see another vehicle approaching too fast, swerving over the center line. Warren tried to brake, tried to turn, but his reactions were too slow, his body too tired, and the impact came with a sound like the world ending. Metal shrieking, glass shattering, his body thrown against the restraints as the vehicle spun and rolled and came to rest in the ditch. But then the moment repeated. Warren was back in the driver's seat before the impact, seeing the other vehicle approach, trying to avoid it, failing, feeling the crash, and then immediately being reset to the moment before. Over and over, the loop tightening, the moment of collision playing out in variations. Sometimes he swerved left, sometimes right. Sometimes he hit the brakes hard, sometimes he accelerated trying to get past. But every version ended the same way, with the crash and the darkness, and then the reset. And through it all, Warren could hear Reuben Castle's voice, hollow and distorted, speaking the truth that Warren had been avoiding for 22 years. "You didn't survive either, Warren. We both died that night. Everything after is just echoes, possibilities, the universe trying to figure out what should have happened. But the loop is closing now. All the versions are converging, and soon there will be nothing left but this moment, forever." Warren opened his eyes and found himself standing in the office building at the mine, Mendoza gripping his shoulder and shaking him hard. "Pike! Pike, snap out of it. You've been standing there for 2 minutes just staring at nothing." Warren blinked, his vision clearing, and realized he was facing the wall where the predictions had been written. But now there were more of them, filling every available surface, spiraling up toward the ceiling and down toward the floor. Dates and times and descriptions of events, all in that cramped handwriting that Warren was beginning to recognize as his own. He stepped closer, ignoring Mendoza's protests, and read the newest entries. They were dated today, March 1st, 2025, with timestamps that started at 6:47 a.m. and continued forward. Officer Pike returns to department, reviews database entries for Reuben Castle. Officer Pike receives phone call from himself, warnings about convergence. Officer Pike returns to mine site at 9:23 a.m. with Officer Mendoza. Warren checked his watch. It was 9:23 a.m. exactly. The predictions weren't predictions at all. They were recordings of events that had already happened, that were happening, that would always happen in this place where time had folded in on itself. "We need to leave," Mendoza said urgently, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Right now, Pike, this place is wrong, and we're not equipped to handle whatever's happening here." Warren wanted to agree, wanted to turn around and walk out and never come back, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He'd tried leaving before in all those other versions that he could now remember like fragments of dreams. He'd driven away from Route 47 dozens of times, hundreds maybe, and every time something had pulled him back. A call from dispatch, an accident report, a nagging feeling that he'd forgotten something important. The loop always closed, always brought him back to this moment. Warren pulled out his phone and called Sheriff Mackenzie, putting her on speaker so Mendoza could hear. "Sheriff, I need you to pull all the dispatch records for Route 47 going back to 2003. Every call, every response, every unit that's been sent to this location. Cross-reference them with my duty logs." There was a pause, the sound of typing, and then the sheriff's voice came back sounding confused and concerned. "Pike, that's going to be a long list. According to the system, you've responded to calls at this location 847 times over the last 22 years. That can't be right. That would mean you've been out there almost once a week for your entire career." Mendoza's face had gone pale, and Warren felt a strange calm settling over him. It made sense now, all of it. The gaps in his memory, the feeling that days sometimes repeated, the way certain conversations felt like they'd happened before. He hadn't been living a normal life for the past 22 years. He'd been cycling through variations of the same events, trapped in a pattern that kept bringing him back to Route 47, to this mine, to the moment of collision with Reuben Castle. And every cycle, every loop, had worn the boundaries thinner, until now they were breaking down completely. "Sheriff, I need you to do something else," Warren said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Pull up my personnel file. Look at my date of hire." More typing, another pause, and when Sheriff Mackenzie spoke again, her voice had changed, gone soft with something that sounded like grief. "Pike, it says you were hired in March 2003, but your academy graduation date is listed as October 15th, 2003. 3 days after your accident with Castle. That's impossible. You can't have been working for us before you graduated from the academy." Warren closed his eyes, feeling the last pieces of his constructed reality crumbling away. "What's my current employment status, according to the file?" The sheriff's answer came after a long silence. "It says you're on administrative leave pending investigation of a fatal accident. October 12th, 2003. Pike, as far as the official records are concerned, you never came back from that leave. You never returned to duty." Warren ended the call and looked at Mendoza, who was staring at him with an expression of dawning horror. "I died in that crash," Warren said quietly. "Reuben was right. We both died that night. But somehow part of me didn't accept it, didn't want to let go, and I've been acting out this fantasy of continuing to work, continuing to live, while actually I've been stuck here the whole time." Mendoza shook his head violently, backing towards the door. No, you're standing right here. I can see you, touch you. You drove here with me. You're real." Warren reached out and grabbed Mendoza's arm, and for just a second he felt the contact, solid and warm and human. But then something shifted, and he could see his hand passing through Mendoza's arm like smoke through air. Mendoza stumbled back with a cry of shock, and Warren looked down at himself, really looked, and saw that he was flickering like a bad television signal. Solid one moment, translucent the next, his uniform shifting between the current style and the older version he'd been wearing in 2003. "You need to leave," Warren told him. "Get out of here while you still can. Go back to the department and tell the sheriff everything. Tell her the loop is breaking, and when it does, this whole place might collapse." But before Mendoza could move, the door to the back room opened and Reuben Castle walked out. Except he wasn't the shambling, possessed figure from last night. He looked like the man in the photographs Warren had seen, healthy and whole, wearing work clothes and a resigned expression. "He can't leave, Warren. None of us can. We're all part of the same moment now, frozen in the second before impact. Your friend Mendoza made the mistake of crossing the threshold. Now he's stuck here with us." Warren turned to look at the door, the exit to the normal world, and saw that it was gone. The wall was solid concrete, no doorway visible, as if it had never existed. Mendoza was pounding on the wall, shouting into his radio for backup, but Warren could see that it was useless. They were sealed inside now, inside the moment, inside the loop that had been Warren's prison for 22 years. "What do you want, Reuben?" Warren asked, turning back to face the man he'd killed. "Why pull me here? Why involve him? If this is about revenge, just end it." Reuben laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound without any real humor. "Revenge? Warren, this isn't about revenge. This is about escape. You think I want to be stuck here? I've been trapped in the moment of my death for more than 2 decades, watching you live out your fantasy life, going through the motions of being a cop, while actually you're just as dead as I am. But the thing is, The loop isn't stable. It's breaking down. And when it finally collapses, we'll both cease to exist entirely. Unless we can find a way to break it from the inside. Warren moved closer, studying Reuben's face, looking for deception but finding only desperate honesty. How? If we're both dead, if this whole thing is just some kind of temporal echo, how do we break it? Reuben gestured toward the back room, and Warren followed him through the doorway. The room had changed since last night. The candles were gone, replaced by a pulsing light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And in the center of the floor, where Reuben had been lying unconscious, there was now a hole, perfectly circular, leading down into darkness. The main shaft, Reuben said. The mine goes deep, hundreds of feet down into the earth. And at the bottom, there's something that predates the mining operation, predates the forest and the road and everything else. Some kind of temporal anomaly, a place where time doesn't flow properly. When we died in that crash, our final moments got caught in its gravity, pulled into its orbit, and we've been spiraling around it ever since. But if we can reach the center, if we can get all the way down to the anomaly itself, maybe we can break the pattern. Warren looked into the hole, seeing the darkness below, and felt a pull that was both terrifying and strangely familiar. And what happens if we do break it? Do we just cease to exist? Do we get another chance? What? Reuben shook his head slowly. I don't know. Maybe we get to actually die properly this time. Maybe we get pulled into whatever comes after. Or maybe we get scattered across all the possible timelines, living out every variation of that night. But anything is better than this, Warren. Anything is better than being stuck in the moment of our deaths forever. Mendoza had joined them in the back room, his radio silent now, his face resigned to whatever was happening. If you two are going down there, he said quietly, I'm coming with you. I don't know what's real anymore, but I know I'm not staying up here alone. Warren wanted to argue, wanted to order Mendoza to stay where it was safe, but he realized there was no safety anymore. The moment they'd crossed the threshold into this place, they'd all become part of the loop. The only way out was through. Warren approached the hole and shone his flashlight down into it. The beam was swallowed by the darkness after about 30 feet, but he could see metal rungs set into the wall, a maintenance ladder descending into the depths of the mine. He tested the first rung carefully and found it solid despite the rust coating every surface. I'll go first, Warren said. Mendoza, you follow me. Reuben, you bring up the rear, and if anyone feels like the ladder's giving way, call out immediately. The descent was slow and treacherous, each rung creaking under their weight, the darkness below seeming to extend infinitely. Warren counted the rungs as he climbed down, trying to keep his mind focused on the physical task rather than the impossibility of what they were doing. 50 rungs, 100, 200. The air grew colder as they descended, their breath forming thick clouds that glowed faintly in their flashlight beams. And gradually, Warren began to hear sounds echoing up from below. Voices, metal on metal, the roar of an engine. Familiar sounds that made his heart race. At 300 rungs, Warren's foot touched solid ground, and he stepped off the ladder onto a floor that hummed with strange energy. They were in a chamber, roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across, and the walls were covered in the same cramped handwriting that had filled the office building above. But these weren't predictions or records. These were names. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, filling every available surface from floor to ceiling. Warren moved closer and began to read, his flashlight beam tracking across the wall. The names were all variations. Warren Pike, Warren K. Pike, W. Pike, Officer Pike. And mixed in with his names were others. Reuben Castle, Reuben K. Castle, R. Castle. but also names Warren didn't recognize at first. Deputy Hargrove, Officer Bittman, Sheriff Mackenzie. And as he read further, he realized with growing horror that these were all people who'd responded to calls at Route 47 over the years. All people who'd gotten too close to the anomaly, who'd been pulled into the orbit of the loop. Some of the names had dates next to them, dates when they'd been freed or escaped, or simply ceased to exist. But many had no dates at all, suggesting they were still trapped somewhere in the pattern. "This isn't just about us," Warren said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "This thing has been pulling in responders for decades, maybe longer. Everyone who investigates Route 47, everyone who tries to solve the mystery of the abandoned vehicles, they all get caught in the loop." Reuben nodded, his expression grim. The anomaly feeds on moments of transition, times when life and death hang in balance. Emergency responders are drawn to it naturally because they exist in those moments professionally. But once you're caught, the only way out is to reach the center. At the far end of the chamber, there was another opening, this one leading to a tunnel that sloped sharply downward. Warren could see light coming from the tunnel. Not the artificial light of flashlights or electric lamps, but a pulsing, organic glow that shifted through colors he couldn't quite name. The three of them moved toward it, drawn by the light despite their fear, and as they entered the tunnel, Warren felt reality beginning to fragment around them. The walls flickered between solid rock and translucent images, showing scenes from different times. The tunnel, as it had been during the mining operation, full of workers and equipment. The tunnel, as it had been before that, just a natural cave formation. And the tunnel as it existed in their present moment, empty and somehow alive with possibility. The tunnel opened into a final chamber, and Warren stopped at the threshold, his breath catching in his throat. The space was enormous, a natural cavern that must have extended hundreds of feet in every direction. But it was impossible to judge the true size because the walls were in constant motion, shifting and flowing like liquid. And suspended in the center of the chamber, defying gravity and sense, was the anomaly itself. It looked like a knot of light and darkness woven together, pulsing with energy that Warren could feel vibrating in his bones. Around it, orbiting like planets around a sun, were vehicles. Patrol cars, ambulances, fire trucks, all of them frozen in mid-motion, their occupants visible through the windows, forever trapped in their last moments. "The moment before death," Reuben whispered. "That's what it collects. Every emergency vehicle that's ever responded to a call in this area, every responder who's died in the line of duty, they all end up here eventually. And we're seeing the ones who never made it out, who got pulled in too deep to escape." Warren walked slowly into the chamber, his eyes tracking over the orbiting vehicles, and he spotted Unit 12A among them. He was sitting in the driver's seat, frozen in the moment of impact, his body twisted and broken, his face locked in an expression of surprise and pain. There were other versions of himself, too, in other vehicles experiencing other variations of the fatal crash. And then Warren saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a vehicle that wasn't frozen, that was still moving slowly through the orbit of the anomaly. It was Mendoza's patrol unit, the one he'd driven to the mine this morning, and through the windshield Warren could see Mendoza himself, frantically working the radio, his mouth moving in what looked like a call for help. "That's impossible," Warren said, turning to look at the Mendoza standing beside him. "You're right here. How can you be in that vehicle?" Mendoza's face had gone ashen, and he stared at the orbiting patrol unit with growing horror. "I'm still in my car," he said slowly. "I never got out. I've been sitting there calling for backup since you went into the office building, but no one's responding. Warren, I think I'm dying. I think something in this place is killing me while I sit in my vehicle, and what's standing here with you is just a projection, a ghost that doesn't know it's dead yet." Warren looked at Reuben, who nodded sadly. The anomaly doesn't just trap moments. It creates echoes, possibilities that branch off from the original event. You're one of those echoes, Mendoza. The real you is in that vehicle, experiencing cardiac arrest from the stress and fear. In about 3 minutes, your heart will stop, and then you'll join the orbit permanently unless we can break the pattern. Warren moved toward the anomaly, feeling its pull growing stronger, and realized that this was what he'd been moving toward for 22 years. This was the center of the loop, the source of the trap, and if he could just reach it, just touch it, maybe he could disrupt the pattern enough to free everyone caught in its gravity. But Reuben grabbed his arm, holding him back with surprising strength. If you touch it directly, you'll be pulled in completely, dissolved into every possible moment of your death simultaneously. That's not escape, Warren. That's worse than being stuck in the loop. Warren turned to face him, seeing the fear in Reuben's eyes, and understood that they were both terrified of what came next. Then what do we do? How do we break it? Reuben pointed to the orbiting vehicles, the frozen moments of death spiraling around the anomaly. Every one of those represents someone who died responding to an emergency. Someone who sacrificed themselves trying to help others. The anomaly feeds on that energy, on the moment when someone chooses service over safety. But what if we could reverse it? What if instead of being trapped by our deaths, we could use them to collapse the anomaly from the inside? Warren understood what Reuben was suggesting, and the audacity of it took his breath away. They would have to willingly enter the anomaly, accept their deaths fully and completely, and in doing so, create a paradox that the temporal knot couldn't sustain. If we do this, Warren said quietly, there's no coming back. No echoes, no loops, no second chances. We'll be erased from every timeline, every possibility. It'll be like we never existed at all. Reuben smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it looked genuine. Good. I'm tired of existing like this. I want to actually die, properly, and take this thing with me so no one else has to go through what we've been through. Warren looked at the echo of Mendoza standing beside them, knowing that the real Mendoza was dying in his vehicle and that freeing him was the only way to save his life. Warren and Reuben moved toward the anomaly together, their hands clasped like they were old friends rather than victim and killer, and as they approached, the pulsing light grew brighter and more intense. The orbiting vehicles began to move faster, their paths becoming erratic, and Warren could hear screaming coming from inside them, the trapped souls sensing that something was changing. Warren thought about his daughter, the one he'd believed he had for 22 years, but who might never have existed outside this loop. He thought about Sheriff Mackenzie and Greta and all the people he'd worked with, wondering if they would remember him once the anomaly collapsed, or if his absence would create a new timeline where he'd died in 2003 and never returned to duty. They stepped into the light together, and Warren felt his body beginning to come apart, his molecules separating as the anomaly pulled him into every possible moment of his death. He was in Unit 12A, experiencing the collision from every angle. He was in the hospital, dying on the operating table. He was on Route 47, bleeding out in the wreckage while paramedics tried desperately to save him. And he was here, in the chamber beneath the mine, choosing to end the loop and free everyone trapped within it. The pain was immense, beyond anything Warren had ever experienced. But so was the relief. After 22 years of being stuck, he was finally moving forward, finally reaching the conclusion that should have come the night of the accident. The anomaly began to collapse, its light dimming and its structure unraveling as the paradox of Warren and Reuben's willing sacrifice disrupted its pattern. The orbiting vehicles fell from their paths, crashing to the chamber floor or simply vanishing as the moments they represented were released back into the time stream. Warren saw Mendoza's patrol unit drop, saw his friend slumped over the wheel, and prayed that he would wake up in the normal world with no memory of this place. And then everything went white. A brightness so complete that it erased thought and sensation and left only peace. Mendoza gasped awake in his patrol unit, his hand still clutching the radio mic, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He looked around wildly, taking in his surroundings. He was parked on Route 47, near mile marker 43, and the morning sun was bright and normal. There was no sign of Warren's vehicle, no abandoned Silverado, no evidence that anything unusual had happened here. Mendoza's radio crackled to life, Greta's voice coming through with professional concern. Unit 7, respond. We lost your signal for approximately 20 seconds. What's your status? Mendoza keyed his mic, his voice shaky. Unit 7, I'm okay. I think I fell asleep at the wheel. I'm at Route 47, mile 43, requesting permission to return to station. Greta's response was immediate. Copy that, Unit 7. Return to station and report to the sheriff. We were worried about you. As Mendoza drove back toward the town, he tried to remember why he'd been on Route 47 in the first place. But his memory was foggy, like waking from a dream that dissolved upon examination. He remembered arriving for his shift, remembered routine patrol, but everything after that was blank. At the station, Sheriff Mackenzie called him into her office, and Mendoza noticed that she looked older somehow, tired in a way he didn't remember from yesterday. Mendoza, I need to ask you about Officer Pike, she said, and Mendoza felt a chill run down his spine at the name. Warren Pike. Do you remember working with him? Mendoza tried to access the memory, tried to picture the man's face, but found nothing. I'm sorry, Sheriff. I don't know anyone by that name. Sheriff Mackenzie nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer, and pulled out a file. Warren Pike was one of our officers. He died 22 years ago in a traffic accident on Route 47. His body was never recovered from the wreckage. The investigation was closed, and we moved on. But every year, around the anniversary of his death, strange things happen on that road. Vehicles found abandoned, radio signals that don't make sense, calls from disconnected phone numbers. And every year, I get officers telling me they feel like they're forgetting someone important. Mendoza listened, and as the sheriff spoke, fragments of memory began to surface. A man with graying hair and a weathered face standing beside a patrol unit marked Unit 12A. A voice on the radio, hollow and distorted, calling for help. A descent into darkness, following someone he trusted into impossible depths. But the memories were fading, even as he tried to hold on to them, dissolving like morning mist. I think I met him, Mendoza said quietly. I think he saved my life, but I can't remember how. Sheriff Mackenzie closed the file and looked out her window at the parking lot, where the morning sun painted everything in shades of gold. Maybe that's for the best, she said. Maybe some ghosts are meant to be forgotten so they can finally rest. But I want you to do something for me, Mendoza. Every March, around the anniversary, I need you to avoid Route 47. Don't respond to calls from that location. Don't patrol that area. Let someone else handle it. Someone who wasn't there in the loop. Can you do that? Mendoza agreed, though he didn't fully understand what she meant by in the loop. He left her office and went to his desk, where he found a single photograph tucked under his keyboard. It showed a group of officers at a retirement party, everyone smiling and relaxed, and in the back row, barely visible, was a man who looked familiar. Mendoza stared at the photo, trying to place the face, but the harder he looked, the more it seemed to fade, like the image itself was being erased. He turned the photo over and found a single word written on the back in handwriting he didn't recognize. Free. 3 weeks later, on March 14th, dispatch received a call about an accident on Route 47, mile marker 43. A single vehicle in the ditch, driver unresponsive, requesting immediate assistance. Unit 7, Officer Mendoza, was the closest responder, but before he could confirm, Sheriff Mackenzie's voice came over the radio. "Negative, Unit 7, I'm responding to this one personally." Mendoza felt relief wash over him, though he couldn't quite say why, and watched from his patrol unit as the sheriff drove north toward Route 47. Sheriff Mackenzie arrived at the location and found a dark blue Silverado, driver's door open, no occupant visible. She searched the area thoroughly, but found nothing except a set of footprints leading into the woods. The footprints stopped after 50 feet, simply ending in the middle of a clearing as if the person making them had vanished into thin air. She was about to radio for assistance when her boot kicked something half buried in the snow. It was a badge, tarnished and old, with a number stamped on its face, 847. The sheriff picked up the badge and turned it over, reading the name engraved on the back. Officer Warren Pike. She stood there in the clearing for a long moment, holding the badge and looking up at the morning sky, and she whispered words that were carried away by the wind and heard by no one. "Rest easy, Pike. Your watch is over." She pocketed the badge and returned to her vehicle, closing out the call as unfounded. As she drove away from Route 47, she glanced in her rearview mirror and thought she saw a figure standing at the tree line, wearing a sheriff's uniform and raising a hand in farewell. But when she looked again, there was nothing there except the empty road and the forest, and the morning light painting everything gold. In Cascade County Dispatch, Greta Hollins was reviewing old call logs when she came across an anomaly in the system. There were 847 calls listed for Route 47 over the past 22 years, all assigned to Unit 12A, all marked as resolved with no report filed. She started to investigate further, but as her cursor hovered over the entries, they began to delete themselves one by one, disappearing from the database like they'd never existed. Within minutes, the logs were clean, showing only normal traffic for the location, and Greta found she couldn't remember why she'd been looking at Route 47 in the first place. The old mining site sat empty and abandoned on its plateau, the buildings slowly collapsing under the weight of snow and time. The main shaft, sealed decades ago with concrete and steel, remained undisturbed. But if you stood in the clearing on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the wind was still, you could hear sounds echoing up from deep below. Not the sounds of something trapped, but the sounds of something finally at peace. Two voices, laughing together like old friends, fading slowly into silence as the earth reclaimed what had always belonged to it. And on Route 47, mile marker 43, where the shoulder meets the tree line and the forest presses close to the road, there are no more abandoned vehicles, no more strange calls or garbled radio transmissions. The anomaly that had fed on death and sacrifice for generations was gone, collapsed by two men who chose to end their loop rather than remain trapped forever. Local residents say the stretch of road feels lighter now, less oppressive, though they can't quite explain what changed. And on cold March nights, when the wind comes down from the mountains and the pine trees creak in the darkness, some say they can still hear the distant wail of a siren, fading into memory like a dream you can't quite remember upon waking. Officer Warren Pike's name appears on no memorial wall, no plaque, no official record of service. The timeline adjusted itself, filled in the gaps, and moved forward without him. But in a filing cabinet in Sheriff Mackenzie's office, locked in a drawer she never opens, there's a badge numbered 847 and a photograph of a man with graying hair and a weathered face, standing beside a patrol unit that doesn't exist in any inventory. And on the back of that photograph, written in her own handwriting so she won't forget, are the words, He saved us all. Remember. The call came in at 11:34 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The kind of late-shift call that could go either way. A genuine emergency or another lonely resident hearing the house settle and letting their imagination run wild. Delilah Crane had been working dispatch for the Little Rock suburbs for 8 years, and she'd learned to read the subtle cues in a caller's voice that separated real fear from manufactured drama. This caller, a woman who identified herself as Helen Duvall, had the kind of fear that made Delilah sit up straighter in her chair and reach for her coffee, knowing this was going to require her full attention. Helen's voice was steady but strained, like someone trying very hard to maintain control while their world fell apart around them. She reported hearing voices in her home, specifically coming from inside the walls of her bedroom. Not animal sounds, not pipes or wind or any of the usual explanations people offered when they called about strange noises. Voices. Multiple voices. Having conversations that Helen couldn't quite make out but that she swore were human. She'd been hearing them for 3 nights now, getting progressively louder, and tonight they'd woken her from sleep with what sounded like someone calling her name from inside the wall beside her bed. Delilah typed the information into the computer system as Helen spoke, pulling up the address on her mapping software. It was a quiet residential street in one of the older suburbs, the kind of neighborhood where ranch houses from the 60s sat on half-acre lots with mature trees and well-maintained lawns. Not the sort of place where you'd expect trouble, but Delilah had been doing this job long enough to know that trouble didn't discriminate by zip code. She dispatched Officer Miles Corbett, who was patrolling the area and had a reputation for being good with civilians, patient and thorough without being condescending. If this was just a frightened woman who needed reassurance, Miles would provide it. If it was something more, he'd handle that too. Miles acknowledged the dispatch and turned his patrol unit toward the address, the streetlights of suburban Arkansas painting the empty roads in pools of orange light. He'd been with the department for 12 years, long enough to have seen most variations of domestic calls and noise complaints, and he approached each one with the same professional courtesy regardless of how trivial it might seem. People called 911 when they were scared, and taking their fear seriously was part of the job. He pulled up to the Duvall residence at 11:47 p.m., noting the well-kept exterior and the porch light that had been left on, probably in anticipation of his arrival. Helen Duvall answered the door before Miles could knock, like she'd been watching for him through the window. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short dark hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many sleepless nights. She wore a bathrobe over pajamas and clutched a cordless phone in one hand like it was a lifeline. Miles introduced himself and asked if he could come inside, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. Helen nodded quickly and stepped back, her eyes darting to the hallway that led deeper into the house like she expected something to emerge from the darkness. The interior of the house was clean and modestly furnished. Nothing that raised any red flags. Family photos on the walls, a lived-in quality to the furniture. The kind of home that spoke of stability and routine. Miles asked Helen to walk him through what she'd been experiencing, and she led him to the bedroom, speaking in a low voice as if afraid of being overheard. The bedroom was at the back of the house, a master suite with an attached bathroom and a large closet. Helen pointed to the wall beside her bed, an interior wall that separated the bedroom from what Miles assumed was a hallway or another room. "That's where it comes from," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right there, inside that wall. I can hear them talking, sometimes arguing. Once I heard what sounded like crying, and tonight I swear I heard my name. Someone inside the wall said Helen, clear as day, and that's when I called you." Miles moved closer to the wall and knocked on it experimentally, listening to the hollow sound that suggested standard drywall construction over wooden studs. Nothing unusual about the structure itself. He pulled out his flashlight and examined the wall carefully, looking for any signs of damage or modification, any holes or vents where sound might be traveling from another part of the house. "Mrs. Duval, do you live alone?" Miles asked, still examining the wall. Helen nodded, wrapping her bathrobe tighter around herself. "I've been divorced for 6 years. My son used to live here, but he's away at college now. It's just me." Miles made a note of that, considering the possibilities. An empty house, a woman living alone, stress and isolation could create all sorts of auditory phenomena, but he kept those thoughts to himself and continued his examination. And the voices, are they always in this location? Just this wall? Helen considered the question, and Miles could see her trying to be precise, trying to give him information that would help. "Mostly this wall, yes. But sometimes I think I hear them from other places too. The living room, the kitchen, like they're moving around the house, or like there are multiple sources." That changed things slightly. If the sounds were localized to one wall, it could be plumbing or rodents or a dozen other mundane explanations. But if they were coming from multiple locations, that suggested either something more complex or something psychological. Miles asked Helen's permission to check the attic and crawl space, looking for any evidence of animals or structural issues that might explain the sounds. Helen agreed readily, clearly hoping he would find some simple explanation that would let her sleep peacefully again. Miles retrieved a ladder from his patrol unit and accessed the attic through a panel in the hallway ceiling. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with the usual detritus of years of storage. Boxes of holiday decorations, old furniture, the accumulated possessions that people couldn't quite bring themselves to throw away. But there was no evidence of animals, no droppings or nesting materials, no signs that anything living had been up here recently. The crawl space beneath the house was similarly unremarkable, just the usual tangle of plumbing and electrical wiring, dust and cobwebs, but nothing that would produce the sounds Helen described. Miles emerged from his inspection and returned to the bedroom, where Helen waited anxiously. "I didn't find anything that would account for what you're hearing," Miles said carefully. "No animals, no obvious structural issues. But I'd like to stay for a bit, see if I can hear what you're describing. Sometimes, fresh ears can pick up things that help identify the source." Helen looked relieved and gestured to a chair near the bed. "Thank you. I was starting to think I was losing my mind." Miles settled into the chair and checked his watch. It was just past midnight now, and his shift didn't end until 6 a.m. He had time to wait and listen, to give Helen the reassurance she needed. The bedroom was quiet, just the ambient sounds of a house at night, the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the occasional creak of settling wood, the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. Normal sounds, nothing that would cause alarm. They sat in silence for perhaps 15 minutes, Helen perched on the edge of her bed and Miles in the chair, both of them listening intently. Miles was about to suggest that perhaps the sounds had stopped for the night when he heard it. A voice, faint and muffled, coming from somewhere inside the walls. He sat up straighter, his attention laser-focused, trying to pinpoint the location and identify what he was hearing. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, just the cadence of human speech, rising and falling like a conversation in progress. Helen's eyes widened, and she looked at Miles with an expression that was equal parts vindication and terror. "You hear it too? I'm not imagining it?" Miles raised a hand asking for silence and stood up slowly. He moved toward the wall, pressing his ear against it, trying to isolate the sound. It was definitely voices, plural, at least 2 different speakers, and they seemed to be having some kind of discussion. But the words were indistinct, garbled, like listening to a radio station that was almost but not quite in tune. Miles pulled out his phone and started recording, documenting the sound for later analysis. The voices continued for another 2 minutes, then gradually faded into silence, leaving only the normal ambient noise of the house. Miles played back his recording, and the voices were clearly audible on the playback, which ruled out mass hallucination or some kind of psychological phenomenon. Something was creating those sounds, something real and physical, and Miles needed to figure out what. He radioed dispatch, requesting that Delilah run a history on the address, looking for any previous calls or incidents that might provide context. While they waited for Delilah to respond, Miles walked through the house more carefully, trying to think like an investigator rather than just a responding officer. The layout was typical for houses of this era: living room, kitchen, and dining room in the front, bedrooms and bathrooms along a central hallway, all single-story construction on a concrete slab foundation. The walls were standard drywall. The floors were carpet over concrete. Nothing unusual about the construction. But as Miles examined the house, he noticed something odd. In the hallway outside Helen's bedroom, there was a section of wall that didn't quite match the rest. The paint was slightly different, a shade or two lighter than the surrounding walls, and when Miles tapped on it, the sound was different too. More solid, like there was something behind the drywall that wasn't present elsewhere. He pulled out his flashlight and examined the wall more closely, running his fingers along the seams, and found evidence of patching and repainting. Someone had opened this wall at some point and then sealed it back up, and they'd done a decent job, but not quite good enough to hide all traces of the work. "Mrs. Duval, have you done any renovations or repairs on the house recently?" Miles asked, still studying the wall. Helen came to stand beside him, looking at the section he was indicating. "No, nothing. I haven't had any work done since I moved in 6 years ago." "Why?" Miles traced his finger along a seam in the drywall. "Because someone patched this wall, and fairly recently, within the last few years, I'd estimate. The paint doesn't quite match, and the texture's different." "Did the previous owners mention any repairs they'd done?" Helen shook her head slowly, and Miles could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to remember details from the home purchase. The house was sold as is. The previous owners had moved out months before we closed, and they were living out of state by then. We did a standard inspection, but nothing came up that would require wall repairs. Miles made a note to look into the previous owners, to find out if there were any records of work permits or contractor visits. But even as he thought about the mundane explanations, a small voice in the back of his mind was suggesting something darker. Delilah's voice came through on the radio, pulling Miles from his thoughts. "Unit 9, dispatch. I've pulled the history on that address, and there's something you should know. We've had multiple calls from that location over the past 15 years, all reporting similar issues. Voices, sounds in the walls, strange occurrences. The calls go back to before the current resident moved in, back to at least 3 different owners." Miles felt a chill run down his spine, and he saw Helen's face go pale as she heard the dispatcher's words. "Delilah, what kind of calls are we talking about?" Miles kept his voice professional, but he could feel his pulse quickening. There was a pause as Delilah reviewed her screen, and when she spoke again, her voice had a careful quality to it, like she was choosing her words deliberately. "Noise complaints, welfare checks, and 2 missing person reports. The missing person reports are what caught my attention. In '98, a woman named Dorothy Vance was reported missing from this address by her husband. She was never found. In 2006, another missing person report. This time, a teenage girl named Amy something. The record's partially corrupted. She lived here with her mother and vanished one night without a trace. Both cases are still technically open but have been cold for years." Miles looked at Helen, who had gone from pale to almost gray, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "Mrs. Duval, did you know about this when you bought the house?" Helen shook her head vigorously. "No, God no. If I'd known people had disappeared from here, I never would have bought it. The realtor never mentioned anything, and it wasn't in any of the disclosure documents." That was potentially a legal issue, but it was secondary to the immediate situation. Miles needed to understand what they were dealing with, whether this was something that required additional resources or specialized investigation. "Delilah, I'm going to need you to pull everything you can find on those missing person cases. I also want records of all calls from this address, complete transcripts if available, and put me through to Detective Harmon if he's available. This might be bigger than a simple noise complaint." Miles could hear Delilah typing, executing the requests, and he turned his attention back to Helen. "Mrs. Duval, I need to ask you some questions that might seem strange, but please answer as honestly as you can. Have you experienced anything else unusual since moving into this house? Things moving, cold spots, feelings of being watched, anything at all?" Helen sank down to sit on the floor, her back against the wall, and Miles could see tears forming in her eyes. "I thought I was just being paranoid. I've been having nightmares, terrible ones, about people trapped in small spaces screaming for help. And sometimes I wake up and could swear someone was standing in my room, but when I turn on the light, there's nobody there. I convinced myself it was just stress from the divorce, from being alone in the house. But now you're telling me people have disappeared from here, and I don't know what to think." Before Miles could respond, the voices started again, much louder this time, so loud that they seemed to fill the entire hallway. Not just the muffled conversational tones from before, but clear words, shouted with urgency and desperation. "Help us! Please, someone help us! We can't get out!" Miles felt every hair on his body stand up, and he grabbed for his radio instinctively. Helen was on her feet, backing away from the wall, her hands over her ears, and Miles could see absolute terror in her face. The voices continued, overlapping now, multiple speakers all calling out at once. Some sounded like they were crying, others screaming, all of them begging for help with an intensity that cut through Miles like a knife. He pulled out his phone and dialed dispatch directly, needing the immediacy of a phone call rather than the radio. "Delilah, I need backup at this location immediately. I need a supervisor, and I need you to contact the fire department. We might have people trapped inside the structure of this house." Delilah's response was immediate and professional, dispatching additional units and notifying fire rescue. But Miles could hear the concern in her voice. "Miles, what's happening there?" He didn't have a good answer. What was happening defied his training and experience, existed somewhere outside the realm of normal police work. But people were calling for help, and regardless of how impossible the situation seemed, his job was to help them. "I'm hearing multiple voices coming from inside the walls of this residence, Delilah. They're calling for help. I need to open these walls and find out what's behind them." Miles turned to Helen, who was now sitting on the floor in the hallway, her face in her hands, sobbing. "Mrs. Duval, I need your permission to open this wall. I know it's your home and this is going to cause damage, but if there's any chance someone is trapped inside the structure, we need to act immediately." Helen looked up at him, and through her tears she nodded. "Do it. Do whatever you need to do. I can't live here knowing people might be suffering behind these walls." Miles went to his patrol unit and retrieved a heavy-duty flashlight and the tactical tool he carried for breaking windows and forcing doors. The voices had subsided again, falling back to that muffled conversational tone, but Miles knew they would return. He positioned himself in front of the patched section of wall and raised the tool, hesitating for just a moment before swinging it hard into the drywall. The tool punched through easily, leaving a jagged hole about the size of a fist, and immediately Miles smelled something that made his stomach turn. It was the smell of decay, of organic matter that had been sealed away for a long time, breaking down slowly in the darkness. Miles covered his nose and mouth with his sleeve and used the flashlight to peer into the hole he'd created. What he saw in that brief glimpse before backup arrived would stay with him for the rest of his life. Behind the drywall, in the space that should have contained nothing but wooden studs and insulation, there was a space. Not a large space, maybe 3 feet deep and 6 feet tall, but deliberately constructed, walled off from the rest of the house. And in that space, illuminated by his flashlight beam, Miles saw bones. Human bones, mixed with rotted fabric and other materials he couldn't immediately identify. But what made him step back from the wall with his heart hammering was that the bones weren't just lying there as if someone had been placed in the space and left to die. They were arranged, positioned deliberately, and there were multiple sets of them. Multiple victims sealed into this hidden cavity like specimens in a grotesque collection. Miles was still trying to process what he'd seen when he heard sirens approaching, the cavalry arriving in the form of additional patrol units and fire rescue. But even as help approached, even as the professional machinery of investigation and recovery began to mobilize, the voices started again. And this time, mixed with the calls for help and the crying and the screaming, Miles heard something else. He heard his own name. Miles, the voices whispered from inside the wall, in tones that ranged from pleading to accusatory to something that almost sounded like warning. Miles Corbett, you found us, but you're too late. You're always too late, and now you're part of it too. Detective Sarah Harmon arrived at the Duval residence within 20 minutes of Miles's call, her unmarked sedan pulling up behind a growing collection of emergency vehicles that now included 2 patrol units, a fire rescue truck, and the medical examiner's van. She was a compact woman in her early 50s with short gray hair and the kind of calm, analytical demeanor that came from 26 years of working homicides. She'd seen enough death in her career to be largely immune to its shock value, but as she approached Miles Corbett standing in the front yard, she could see that whatever he'd found inside had rattled him badly. Miles briefed her quickly and professionally, laying out the timeline from the initial call about voices in the walls to his discovery of the hidden cavity and the remains inside. Detective Harmon listened without interrupting, making notes on a small pad she carried, and when Miles finished, she looked toward the house with an expression that managed to combine professional interest with genuine concern. The homeowner, Helen Duvall, she still inside? Miles nodded, gesturing toward the living room window where Helen sat with a victim advocate who'd arrived with one of the patrol units. She's being looked after. Understandably shaken, but cooperative, she gave full consent to open the wall and investigate. Detective Harmon approached the house, pulling on latex gloves as she walked, and Miles followed her inside. The hallway had been cordoned off with crime scene tape, and a forensic technician was already setting up lights and photography equipment. The hole Miles had made in the wall had been carefully expanded by the fire rescue team, creating an opening large enough to see into the hidden space, but not so large that it would compromise the integrity of any evidence inside. Harmon knelt beside the opening and played her flashlight beam across the interior, and Miles watched her face carefully for any reaction. What little color had been in Harmon's expression drained away as she took in the scene. The hidden cavity extended the full length of the hallway, perhaps 12 feet, and was approximately 3 feet deep. The space contained the skeletal remains of what appeared to be at least 3 individuals, arranged in sitting positions against the back wall as if they'd been placed there deliberately. The bones showed signs of trauma, and mixed with them were personal effects. Jewelry, scraps of clothing, a pair of eyeglasses. But what disturbed Harmon most was the condition of the walls inside the cavity. They were covered in writing, scratched into the drywall with fingernails or something equally primitive, words and phrases that spoke of terror and desperation. "We're going to need to document every inch of this before we start extracting remains," Harmon said quietly, standing up and addressing the forensic team. "I want photographs from every angle, measurements, samples of the writing, and someone get the medical examiner in here. Dr. Faulkner needs to see this in situ before we move anything." The team moved into action with practiced efficiency, and Harmon pulled Miles aside, away from the immediate activity. "You said dispatch found historical records of missing persons from this address. I need everything they have, and I need it now. We're going to need to run dental records and DNA on these remains, try to identify who they were." Miles nodded and keyed his radio, relaying the request to Delilah. Within minutes, she was transmitting case file numbers and confirming that she was pulling complete records for both Dorothy Vance, missing since 1988, and Amy Thatcher, she'd found the complete name now, missing since 2006. Harmon made notes of the names, committing them to memory, and turned her attention back to the scene. The medical examiner, Dr. Marcus Faulkner, had arrived and was now examining the remains through the opening, his practiced eye taking in details that would be invisible to a layperson. "Based on decomposition and skeletal development, I'm seeing adult remains and at least one juvenile," Dr. Faulkner said without looking up from his examination. "The positioning suggests they were placed here post-mortem, not sealed in alive, though I'll need to examine the bones more closely to confirm. There's evidence of peri-mortem trauma on several of the skulls, blunt force consistent with a heavy object. This wasn't natural death, Detective. This was murder, and whoever did it went to considerable effort to hide the bodies." Harmon absorbed this information with a grim expression, already mentally constructing the investigation that would need to unfold. Miles moved to check on Helen, who was still sitting in the living room with the victim advocate, a young woman named Rachel who specialized in helping crime victims cope with trauma. Helen looked small and fragile, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the house, her eyes distant and unfocused. Miles sat down carefully, not wanting to intrude but needing to ask questions that couldn't wait. "Mrs. Duval, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about the house's history. When you purchased it, did you meet the previous owners? Did they mention anything unusual about the property?" Helen shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper when she spoke. "I never met them. Everything was handled through realtors and lawyers. The sellers were an elderly couple who'd moved to Arizona for health reasons. Their names were," she paused, trying to remember, "Burkhart. Frank and Margaret Burkhart. They'd owned the house for almost 30 years. Miles made a note of the names, knowing that Harmon would want to interview the Burkharts as soon as possible. 30 years of ownership meant they would have been here during both missing person incidents, and if there were bodies sealed inside the walls, the Burkharts either knew about it or were responsible. Detective Harmon had been listening from the hallway and now approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Duval, I'm Detective Sarah Harmon. I'm going to be leading the investigation into what we found in your home. I need to inform you that this house is now an active crime scene, and you won't be able to stay here for at least several days, possibly longer. Do you have somewhere you can go? Family? Friends?" Helen nodded weakly. "I have a sister in Conway. She said I could stay with her as long as I need." Harmon softened slightly, her professional demeanor giving way to genuine sympathy. "That's good. Officer Corbett will help you pack some essentials, and will arrange transportation to your sister's place. I'll need to get a formal statement from you tomorrow, but for tonight, you need to be somewhere you feel safe." While Miles helped Helen gather clothes and toiletries from the parts of the house that hadn't been cordoned off, Harmon returned to the hallway where the forensic team was making steady progress documenting the scene. The writing on the walls of the hidden cavity had been photographed in sections, and Harmon studied the images on the technician's camera screen, trying to make sense of the messages. Some were simple pleas, help me, let me out, please God no, while others were more disturbing. He's coming back, one section read. He says we're special. He says we get to stay forever. And at the very back of the cavity, written in letters that were larger and more deliberate than the rest, was a message that made Harmon's blood run cold. There are more. Look down. Harmon immediately ordered the forensic team to examine the floor of the cavity, and they carefully removed the skeletal remains to access the surface beneath. What they found confirmed Harmon's worst fears. The floor of the cavity wasn't the concrete slab foundation that should have been there. It was wood, rough-cut planks that had been laid over what appeared to be another space below. The house had a basement or crawl space that wasn't documented in any of the official records, a hidden level that the original construction plans didn't show. And if the message on the wall was accurate, that hidden space contained more victims. Miles had finished helping Helen pack and had arranged for a patrol unit to transport her to her sister's house when Harmon called him back to the hallway. "We've got a bigger problem than we thought," she said, pointing to the wooden floor that the forensic team had exposed. "There's another level below the house, and based on this writing, it's not empty. We're going to need to access it, and that means either finding an existing entrance or creating one. I've called for a structural engineer to assess the safety before we proceed, but I wanted to give you a heads up. This investigation is going to be extensive." Miles looked at the wooden planks, trying to understand how an entire level of a house could be hidden from inspectors and owners for decades. How is that possible? Don't home inspections include foundation checks? Wouldn't someone have noticed an inconsistency between the interior volume and the external dimensions? Harmon nodded grimly. You'd think so, but houses from the 60s, especially in suburban developments, they weren't always built to current standards. And if the original owner was involved in the construction, if he was the one who built these hidden spaces, he would have known how to conceal them from inspections. We're dealing with someone who was methodical, patient, and very good at hiding evidence. The structural engineer arrived an hour later. A balding man in his 60s named Tom Reinhardt, who'd worked with the police department on previous cases involving structural damage and concealed spaces. He examined the cavity carefully, taking measurements and consulting building plans that Harmon had obtained from the county records office. After 30 minutes of careful assessment, Reinhardt delivered his findings. The hidden cavity in the hallway is supported by a wooden framework that's independent of the house's main structure. It's essentially a false wall, built inside the real wall, creating a dead space that wouldn't be obvious from standard inspections. The wooden floor you found is definitely covering something below, and based on the construction techniques, I'd estimate this work was done sometime in the late 1960s, probably when the house was originally built. Can we safely access the lower level? Harmon asked, and Reinhardt considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, but we'll need to do it methodically. We can't just start tearing up floors without risking collapse. I recommend we access through the garage, which sits on the same foundation level. If there's a hidden basement, there's likely an entrance from the garage that would have been used to access it originally. It would have been easier to conceal a door in a garage than inside the living space. Harmon agreed with this approach, and the team relocated to the garage, a standard two-car structure attached to the house on the north side. The garage was cluttered with the usual accumulation of household items, garden tools, holiday decorations, an old push mower. But as the team began systematically examining the space, they found what they were looking for. Along the back wall, behind a tall metal shelving unit loaded with paint cans and storage boxes, there was a section of wall that didn't match the rest. The concrete was newer, poured more recently than the original foundation, and when Reinhardt tapped on it with a hammer, the sound was hollow. "This is it," he said confidently. "There's a space behind this wall, and someone went to considerable trouble to seal it up." The forensic team carefully removed the shelving unit and its contents, documenting the position of everything, and then Reinhardt marked out a section of the concrete wall for removal. Using a concrete saw and jackhammer, working slowly to minimize damage and preserve any evidence, they created an opening large enough for a person to pass through. As the last section of concrete fell away, a rush of stale air escaped from the darkness beyond, carrying with it a smell that everyone in the garage recognized immediately. It was the smell of death, stronger and more recent than what they'd encountered in the hallway cavity. Detective Harmon was the first through the opening, her flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal a space that was larger than anyone had anticipated. It was a proper basement, roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling height of about 7 feet, but it had been constructed entirely in secret, hidden from building inspectors and subsequent owners, a private domain where something terrible had occurred over many years. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was packed earth, and scattered throughout the space were items that told a story of horror that spanned decades. There were restraints bolted to the walls, chains and handcuffs that showed signs of long use. There was furniture, a table, chairs, a mattress on a metal frame, all positioned like a grotesque parody of a living space. And there were more remains, at least 4 sets of skeletal bodies in various states of decomposition, some so old they had almost completely returned to the earth, others recent enough that tissue and clothing were still partially intact. But what drew Harmon's attention most was a filing cabinet against the far wall, its metal surface rusted but still intact. Miles had followed Harmon into the basement, and together they approached the filing cabinet, both of them knowing that whatever documents it contained would be crucial to understanding what had happened in this house. Harmon pulled open the top drawer carefully, half expecting it to be empty or filled with innocuous household records. Instead, she found meticulously organized files, each one labeled with a name and date. Dorothy Vance, 1998. Amy Thatcher, 2006. But there were others too, many others, names going back to 1967 when the house was first constructed. Patricia Lennox, 1967. Susan Fitzgerald, 1972. Caroline Marsh, 1981. The list went on, a catalog of victims that numbered in the dozens. Each file contained photographs, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be detailed records of the victim's time in captivity. Harmon felt her stomach turn as she flipped through the pages, seeing the systematic documentation of torture and murder that had occurred in this basement over more than 4 decades. "This wasn't just a killer," she said quietly to Miles, who was reading over her shoulder. "This was a collector, someone who saw his victims as possessions to be cataloged and preserved. And he operated for over 40 years without anyone suspecting what was happening beneath this suburban house." Miles was pulling files from the lower drawers now, and his hands were shaking as he read the names and dates. "There are 23 files here, Harmon. 23 confirmed victims, and God knows how many more that weren't documented. How did no one notice? How did this go on for so long without someone reporting these people missing?" Harmon had been asking herself the same questions, and she was beginning to form a theory. Look at the selection of victims. They're all young women, mostly late teens to early 20s, but they're not all from the same area. The early ones are from Little Rock and the immediate suburbs, but starting in the 80s, they're from all over the state, a few from out of state. These are people who were transient, vulnerable, the kind of victims who might not be immediately reported missing, or whose disappearances might not be connected. The forensic team had entered the basement now, and was beginning the grim work of documenting and processing the scene. Dr. Faulkner moved from one set of remains to another, making preliminary assessments and taking notes that would inform the full autopsies to come. Harmon pulled out her phone and called the department. requesting additional resources and notifying her captain about the scope of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just a homicide investigation anymore. This was potentially one of the largest serial murder cases in Arkansas history, and it was going to require extensive manpower to process properly. While Harmon coordinated with her captain, Miles continued examining the filing cabinet and found something in the bottom drawer that made him call out urgently. "Detective, you need to see this." Harmon ended her call and joined Miles, looking at what he'd found. It was a leather-bound journal, thick with pages, and when Harmon opened it carefully, she found herself reading what appeared to be a detailed diary written by the killer. The entries spanned decades, beginning in 1967 and continuing all the way to 2019, just 6 years ago. The handwriting was precise and methodical, and the content was deeply disturbing, describing not just the murders but the killer's philosophy, his motivations, his evolution over the years. "I started this project when I built the house," the first entry read. "The basement was always part of the plan, a space where I could pursue my interests without interference. Patricia was the first, and she taught me so much about what I was capable of. She fought hard, but in the end, they all give up. They all realize there's no escape, and then they become docile, compliant, perfect specimens for my collection." Harmon flipped through the pages, each entry more horrifying than the last, and stopped at the final entry, dated March 2019. "Age is finally catching up with me," the entry read. "My hands aren't as steady as they once were, and I can feel my body beginning to fail. Margaret doesn't know about the basement, never has, and I've made arrangements to ensure it stays sealed after we leave. The house will be sold, and the new owners will never suspect what's beneath their feet. My collection will remain undiscovered, a monument to my life's work that will outlast my physical form. But I've left clues, small things that might be found by someone observant enough. I want my work to be discovered eventually, when I'm safely beyond prosecution. I want the world to know what I accomplished, how many years I operated without detection. I am Frank Burkhart, and I am a god in my private domain." Miles felt physically ill reading those words, and Harmon's face had gone hard with barely suppressed rage. Frank Burkhart, the elderly man who'd sold the house to Helen Duvall 6 years ago, had been a serial killer operating for more than 50 years, and he'd done it from this suburban house while maintaining the appearance of a normal life. "We need to locate Burkhart immediately," Harmon said, her voice tight with urgency. "He's got a 6-year head start, but if he's still alive, I want him in custody. Miles, get back to dispatch and have them run everything on Frank and Margaret Burkhart. Last known address, financial records, any trace we can find. I want to know where they went when they left Arkansas." Miles hurried back to his patrol unit and got on the radio with Delilah, who immediately began searching databases and making calls. While he waited for results, Miles stood in the quiet suburban street, looking at the Duvall house with its normal exterior and its hidden horrors, and tried to process what they'd discovered. This was the kind of case that would define careers and haunt investigators for years. The scope of Burkhart's crimes was staggering, and the fact that he'd operated undetected for so long raised uncomfortable questions about how many other predators might be hiding in plain sight in communities just like this one. Delilah's voice came back through the radio, and her tone told Miles the news wasn't good before she even spoke. "Miles, I've located records for Frank and Margaret Burkhart. They moved to Phoenix, Arizona in 2019. Margaret died in 2021 from complications of Alzheimer's disease. Frank," she paused, and Miles could hear papers rustling. "Frank died in 2023 in a nursing home in Scottsdale. Natural causes, age 87. He was never investigated, never charged, never even questioned about anything related to missing persons or homicides. He died free and unpunished for what he did." Miles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that information settle over him. Justice for Burkhart's victims would be incomplete, limited to identifying remains and notifying families who'd spent years or decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. There would be no trial, no public accounting of the crimes, no opportunity for the victims to confront their killer. Just the cold comfort of finally knowing the truth, and even that would come too late for many of the families. Miles keyed his radio and relayed the information to Detective Harmon, who received it with grim acceptance. "Then our job is to identify every victim we can and give them back their names," Harmon said, standing in the doorway of the basement as the forensic team worked behind her. "We owe them that much. And we document everything, every detail of what Burkhart did, so the full scope of his crimes becomes part of the record. His name doesn't get to be forgotten. He wanted to be remembered as some kind of god, but we'll make sure he's remembered for what he really was, a monster who preyed on vulnerable women for his own gratification." The work of processing the scene continued through the night and into the next day, a methodical excavation of horrors that tested even the most experienced investigators. Each set of remains was carefully documented and removed. Each piece of evidence was cataloged and preserved, and slowly the full picture of Frank Burkhart's crimes began to emerge. The basement had been his private domain for over 50 years, a place where he could indulge his darkest impulses while maintaining the facade of a respectable suburban homeowner. And the hidden cavity in the hallway had been a later addition, built in the 90s when the basement became too full, a supplementary storage space for victims he couldn't fit below. Miles remained at the scene throughout the investigation, providing security and assistance as needed, and as dawn broke on his second sleepless night, he found himself thinking about Helen Duvall. She'd bought this house looking for a fresh start after her divorce, a safe, quiet place to rebuild her life, and instead she'd discovered that she'd been living on top of a mass grave. The voices she'd heard in the walls hadn't been her imagination or some supernatural phenomenon. They'd been the literal cries for help that the victims had scratched into the walls as they died, messages that somehow resonated through the structure of the house, finding their way to the ears of someone who could finally respond. Detective Harmon emerged from the house just as the sun was fully up, her face showing the exhaustion of the long night, but also the satisfaction of knowing they'd done everything possible to process the scene properly. She approached Miles and handed him a cup of coffee that someone had brought from a nearby convenience store. "You did good work here, Corbett. That initial call could have been dismissed as nothing, just another anxious homeowner hearing noises. But you took it seriously, you investigated thoroughly, and because of that, we found these victims. Their families will finally get closure, and Burkhart's crimes won't remain hidden. That matters." Miles accepted the coffee and the praise, but he felt hollow inside, like something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of the world. He'd been a cop long enough to see terrible things, but this was different. This was systematic evil hiding behind suburban normalcy, and it made him wonder how many other houses and how many other quiet neighborhoods concealed similar secrets. "The voices," Miles said quietly, staring at the house. "Helen said they called my name. At the end, right before we found the cavity, the voices said, 'Miles Corbett, you found us. But you're too late. What do you make of that?'" Harmon considered the question, and her answer was measured and careful. "Stress, fear, the power of suggestion. You'd identified yourself to Helen at the start of your response, so your name was in the environment. Under extreme circumstances, the mind can create patterns and meanings that aren't really there. Or," she paused, and Miles could see her weighing whether to continue, "or maybe there's something we don't understand about places where terrible things happen. Maybe trauma leaves an imprint that can be perceived under certain conditions. I don't claim to have answers about what's possible and what isn't, But I've learned not to dismiss the things that witnesses and officers experience at scenes like this. As Miles prepared to finally leave the scene and go home to sleep, he took one last look at the Duval house. The forensic team was still working inside, would be for days more, and the house itself would eventually be demolished, too contaminated by its history to ever be lived in again. But Miles knew that the memory of what had been discovered here would persist, would become part of the lore of the department and the community, whispered about in briefing rooms and at family dinners. The house where dozens of women disappeared into walls and were never seen again. The house where a monster lived in plain sight for 5 decades. The house that finally spoke up and revealed its terrible secrets to anyone willing to listen. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery at the Duval house, and Miles Corbett found himself unable to shake the feeling that the investigation wasn't over. The forensic work was complete. The remains had been removed and were undergoing analysis at the State Crime Lab, and Detective Harmon's team had begun the painstaking process of matching the recovered bodies to the names in Frank Burkhart's files. So far, they'd positively identified 7 victims through dental records and DNA comparison, and each identification meant another family finally receiving answers after years or decades of not knowing. But something nagged at Miles, a sense that they'd missed something important in that house. And he found himself returning to the scene during his off-duty hours, walking through the empty rooms and trying to understand what was bothering him. The house was slated for demolition in 2 weeks, the county having declared it structurally unsound after the removal of the hidden basement and the various cavities cut into the walls during the investigation. Helen Duval had signed over the property to the county in exchange for release from her mortgage, wanting nothing more to do with the place where she'd unknowingly lived above the graves of dozens of women. Miles had checked in on her once, driving to Conway to take her formal statement, and found her staying with her sister in a small apartment that felt safe and temporary. Helen was seeing a therapist and trying to process the trauma of what she'd experienced, but Miles could see in her eyes that she'd been fundamentally changed by living in that house, by hearing those voices that turned out to be literal cries for help echoing through the decades. Miles stood in the hallway where he'd first broken through the wall, the space now gutted and exposed, showing the skeleton of the house's construction. The forensic team had removed everything from the hidden cavity, the remains, the personal effects, even sections of the wall where the scratched messages had been most clear. But Miles found himself staring at the space, trying to imagine what it had been like for the victims sealed inside, knowing they were in a suburban house full of normal families living normal lives just feet away, yet unable to make anyone hear them. The psychological horror of that, the desperation and slow realization that no help was coming, it haunted Miles in a way that the physical evidence hadn't. Detective Harmon had given Miles access to copies of the case files, understanding that as the first responder who'd made the initial discovery, he had a personal investment in seeing the investigation through. Miles had read through Frank Burkhart's journal multiple times, trying to understand the mind of a man who could commit such systematic evil while maintaining the appearance of a loving husband and respectable neighbor. The entries revealed a man who saw himself as superior to others, who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as objects for his collection, and who took meticulous pride in his ability to operate undetected for so long. But there was something in the journal that troubled Miles, an entry from 2015 that he kept coming back to. "Margaret is becoming suspicious," Burkhart had written. "She's noticed the time I spend in the garage, has asked questions about why certain areas of the house are off-limits. I've maintained my cover by claiming renovation projects and structural concerns, but I can see doubt in her eyes. I may need to make adjustments to ensure her continued ignorance." Miles wondered what those adjustments had been, whether Margaret Burkhart had truly remained ignorant of her husband's crimes, or whether she'd known and chosen to remain silent out of fear or complicity. Miles pulled out his phone and called Detective Harmon, catching her at her desk in the Criminal Investigation Division. "Harmon, it's Corbett. I've been thinking about Margaret Burkhart. Do we have any indication she knew what her husband was doing?" There was a pause as Harmon pulled up her notes, and Miles could hear papers rustling. "We've been operating under the assumption she was unaware. Her medical records show she developed Alzheimer's disease in her early 70s, which would have compromised her memory and awareness for the final years of their marriage. But you're right to question it. I've been trying to locate anyone who knew the Burkharts socially, neighbors or friends who might have insights into their relationship." Miles thanked her and ended the call, but the question continued to bother him. He walked through the rest of the house, his footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, and found himself in the master bedroom where Frank and Margaret would have slept for nearly 30 years. The room had been stripped of furniture and personal effects, leaving only the bare walls and carpeted floor, but Miles moved through it slowly, trying to imagine the daily life that had occurred here. Margaret waking up next to a serial killer, sharing meals with him, living her entire adult life in intimate proximity to someone capable of such monstrous acts. Had she really known nothing, or had there been signs she'd chosen to ignore? Miles was about to leave the bedroom when his boot caught on a section of carpet near the closet, causing it to lift slightly at the edge. He knelt down and examined the spot more carefully, noticing that the carpet wasn't properly tacked down in this area. Working carefully, Miles pulled back a section of the carpet and found that beneath it, someone had cut through the padding and the subflooring to create a small access panel, perhaps 2 feet square. The panel lifted out easily, revealing a shallow space beneath the floor, and inside that space was a box. It was a simple wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, with a hinged lid and a small brass clasp. Miles pulled on his gloves before touching it, his police training overriding his curiosity, and carefully lifted the box out of its hiding place. It was surprisingly heavy, and when Miles opened the lid, he understood why. The box contained jewelry, rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, all carefully wrapped in cloth and tissue paper. But these weren't the kind of jewelry you'd expect to find in a hidden box. These pieces were varied in style and quality, ranging from expensive gold and diamonds to cheap costume pieces, and they clearly hadn't belonged to a single owner. Miles felt his stomach drop as he realized what he was looking at. These were trophies, mementos taken from Burkhart's victims, and they'd been hidden not in the basement with the other evidence of his crimes, but here in the master bedroom, under the carpet near the closet where Margaret would have been only feet away every day of her life. Miles immediately called Detective Harmon back, his voice urgent as he explained what he'd found. "I'm at the house, in the master bedroom. There's a hidden compartment under the carpet, and it contains jewelry that I believe belonged to the victims. You need to get a team back here immediately." Harmon arrived within 20 minutes, bringing a forensic technician with her, and they carefully documented and photographed the hidden compartment before removing the box and its contents. Each piece of jewelry was examined and logged, and Harmon compared them to the lists of personal effects mentioned in Burkhart's files. "These match," she said grimly, holding up a photograph from one of the files that showed a young woman wearing a distinctive silver necklace with a turquoise pendant. In the jewelry box was that same necklace, carefully preserved and wrapped. He was keeping trophies separate from the main collection, hiding them where he could access them easily. The question is whether Margaret knew about this hiding spot. Miles voiced the thought that had been bothering him since he found the box. The compartment is in the master bedroom, near her side of the closet, based on the layout. She would have been in this area daily, changing clothes, cleaning, vacuuming. How could she not have noticed the loose carpet? How could she not have found this box in 30 years of living here? Harmon considered this carefully, her expression troubled. Either she was extraordinarily unobservant, or she knew and chose not to look. There's a third possibility, too. She found it, understood what it meant, and was too afraid of her husband to confront him or report him. They spent the rest of the afternoon searching the rest of the house for additional hidden compartments, and found 2 more. One in the attic, behind a loose section of insulation, contained photographs that weren't in the filing cabinet downstairs, candid shots of women who appeared to be under surveillance, taken without their knowledge in public spaces like shopping centers and bus stops. These were hunting photos, evidence of Burkhart selecting and stalking his victims before abducting them. The second hidden compartment was in the garage, inside a false bottom and a storage bin, and it contained cash, over $40,000 in 20s and 50s, bundled and stored like it was meant to fund an escape if one became necessary. As the sun was setting and the team was preparing to leave, Miles found himself back in the hallway staring at the exposed cavity where the first bodies had been found. Delilah's voice came through on his radio, calling him back to his patrol unit for an incoming call, and Miles reluctantly left the house, promising himself this would be the last time he visited before the demolition. But as he walked to his vehicle, he could have sworn he heard something from inside the house, a faint whisper that sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. "Thank you, Miles. We can rest now." The investigation continued over the following weeks, with Detective Harmon's team working to identify all of the victims and notify their families. Miles returned to his regular patrol duties, but he found himself changed by what he'd experienced. Every call to a residential address made him wonder what secrets might be hidden behind the walls, what horrors might be concealed beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy. He'd become hyper-aware of inconsistencies, of spaces that didn't quite add up, of residents who seemed too eager to keep officers from entering certain rooms. His training officer had once told him that police work was about seeing what others overlooked, and now Miles felt like he was seeing too much, finding suspicious patterns everywhere he looked. Delilah noticed the change in him, mentioning it one night when Miles came into the dispatch center to pick up some paperwork. "You've been different since the Duval house," she said, concern evident in her voice, more withdrawn, more intense. "Have you thought about talking to someone? The department has counseling resources specifically for officers dealing with traumatic cases." Miles appreciated her concern but waved it off, insisting he was fine, just tired from the long hours the investigation had required. But Delilah wasn't convinced, and she pressed him gently. "That case got to all of us, Miles. What that man did, the scope of it, it challenges your faith in human nature. There's no shame in admitting you need help processing it." Before Miles could respond, Delilah's computer chimed with an incoming 911 call, and she immediately focused on her screen, her professional demeanor snapping into place. Miles watched as she took the call, her expression growing more concerned as she listened. "Unit 9, we have a welfare check requested at 4737 Oakmont Drive. Caller reports not hearing from her elderly mother in several days, has been unable to reach her by phone, requesting officer response to check on resident." Miles acknowledged the call and headed out, glad for the distraction from his own thoughts. The address was in an older section of the suburbs, similar to where the Duval house had been located, and as Miles pulled up to the modest ranch-style home, he felt an immediate sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The house looked normal enough, well-maintained yard, newspapers piled up on the driveway indicating no one had collected them in a few days, curtains drawn across all the windows. Miles approached the front door and knocked firmly, calling out his identification. "Police Department, welfare check. Mrs. Garrison, are you home? Your daughter asked us to check on you." There was no response, and Miles tried the door handle, finding it locked. He moved around the house, checking windows and the back door, and found everything secured. But at the back of the house, near what appeared to be a bedroom window, Miles noticed something odd. The ground beneath the window was disturbed, the grass torn up like something heavy had been dragged across it recently, and there were marks on the window frame consistent with it being forced open from the outside. Miles immediately radioed for backup and drew his weapon, preparing to make entry into what was now potentially a crime scene. Using his tactical flashlight to break the window that showed signs of forced entry, Miles climbed through carefully, his weapon and light moving in tandem as he cleared the bedroom. The room was empty, but showed signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, items knocked off the nightstand, and dark stains on the carpet that Miles suspected might be blood. He moved through the house methodically, clearing each room, and found the elderly resident, Mrs. Eleanor Garrison, in the bathroom. She was deceased, lying in a position that suggested she'd been trying to reach the phone when she collapsed, and there was trauma to her head consistent with a blow from a blunt object. Miles secured the scene and called for Detective Harmon, knowing this was now a homicide investigation. And while he waited for her arrival, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The bathroom, where Mrs. Garrison's body lay, had a large medicine cabinet mounted on the wall, and behind it, barely visible where the cabinet met the wall, was a gap. Not a natural gap from poor construction, but a deliberate space, like the cabinet was concealing something. Miles didn't touch anything, not wanting to contaminate the scene, but he photographed the gap from multiple angles and made detailed notes. When Detective Harmon arrived and Miles showed her what he'd found, she brought in the same structural engineer who'd worked the Duval case. Tom Reinhardt examined the bathroom wall carefully and confirmed Miles's suspicion. There's a cavity behind this wall, similar to what we found at the other house. It's smaller, maybe 3 feet deep and 6 feet tall, but it's definitely there. And based on the construction techniques, I'd say it was built around the same time period, late 60s to early 70s. Harmon and Miles exchanged a look, and Miles voiced what they were both thinking. How many houses in this area have hidden spaces like this? Harmon made the decision to open the wall, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. The cavity contained the skeletal remains of a single victim, a young woman who'd been sealed into the space decades earlier. With her remains was identification, a driver's license for a woman named Karen Mullins, reported missing in 1969 from Little Rock, her case never solved. And on the wall of the cavity, scratched in the same desperate manner they'd seen at the Duval house, was a message. His name is Frank Burkhart. He took me from the bus stop. Please find my family. Miles felt the world tilt around him as he read those words. Frank Burkhart hadn't just operated from his own house. He'd built hidden spaces in other houses, created multiple killing sites across the suburbs, establishing a network of concealed graves that had remained undiscovered for more than 50 years. Mrs. Garrison's death appeared to be unrelated to the cavity. The medical examiner determined she'd been killed during a home invasion robbery, but the timing of her death and the subsequent discovery of the cavity seemed almost cosmically arranged, as if the universe was determined to expose all of Burkhart's secrets. Detective Harmon immediately initiated a comprehensive investigation into the construction history of the entire neighborhood. They pulled building permits from the 1960s and 70s, cross-referenced them with Burkhart's work history. He'd been a general contractor specializing in residential construction, and identified dozens of houses he'd worked on during that era. Each house would need to be examined, potentially opened up to search for additional hidden cavities, and the scope of the investigation expanded exponentially. Harmon called in resources from the state police and the FBI, recognizing that this was beyond the capacity of the local department to handle alone. Miles found himself assigned to the task force that was created to investigate what was now being called the Burkhart Network, a term that made it sound almost organized and professional rather than the reality of what it was. A serial killer's distributed graveyard scattered across suburban Arkansas. Over the following month, they examined 17 houses that Burkhart had worked on, and found hidden cavities in 11 of them. Not all contained remains. Some were empty, suggesting Burkhart had built them as options but never used them. But 7 contained additional victims, bringing the total body count to 31 confirmed dead, with several sets of remains still being analyzed and identified. Each discovery was a media sensation, the local news covering the story extensively, and the community was gripped by a mixture of horror and fascination. Homeowners whose houses had been built or renovated by Burkhart demanded inspections, and a cottage industry of structural engineers and home inspectors emerged, specializing in searching for hidden spaces. The psychological impact on the community was profound, with residents questioning whether they really knew the places they lived, whether safety and security were illusions that could be shattered by what lay concealed behind their walls. Miles worked the case obsessively, spending his days conducting searches and his nights reviewing files, driven by a need to find all of Burkhart's victims and give them the justice they'd been denied in life. But the investigation was taking a toll on him, the cumulative weight of so much death and suffering affecting him in ways he was only beginning to recognize. He had nightmares about being sealed into walls, about scratching messages that no one would read, about calling for help that would never come. He found himself avoiding his apartment, not wanting to be alone with his thoughts, and spending more and more time at the office or in his patrol unit. It was Delilah who finally confronted him, finding him sitting in his parked vehicle outside the station at 3 a.m, staring at nothing. She knocked on his window and gestured for him to roll it down, and when he did, she looked at him with genuine concern. "Miles, you're not okay. Everyone can see it. You need to take some time off. Get away from this case. Talk to someone about what you're experiencing." Miles wanted to argue, to insist he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself telling Delilah everything: the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the feeling that he was somehow responsible for all the victims they were finding, that if he'd been there sooner or looked harder or been smarter, maybe he could have saved them. Delilah listened without interrupting, and when Miles finally ran out of words, she spoke with the kind of gentle firmness that came from years of talking people through crises. "You didn't create this situation, Miles. Frank Burkhart did. What you did was respond to a call professionally, investigate thoroughly, and expose crimes that would have otherwise remained hidden forever. Because of you, 31 families have answers they've been searching for, some of them for decades. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like enough." She paused, then continued, "But you can't carry all of this alone. The department has resources, counselors who specialize in helping officers deal with traumatic cases. I'm going to set up an appointment for you, and I need you to go. Not just for yourself, but because you're a good cop and we need you to be healthy so you can keep doing this job." Miles agreed, too exhausted to resist, and over the following weeks he began working with a department psychologist who helped him process what he'd experienced. The sessions were difficult, requiring him to confront feelings and fears he'd been avoiding. But slowly Miles began to feel like himself again. The nightmares became less frequent, the hypervigilance eased, and he was able to return to regular patrol duties without feeling overwhelmed by suspicion and dread. The investigation into the Burkhart network continued, but Miles stepped back from active involvement, recognizing that he needed distance from the case to maintain his mental health. Detective Harmon checked in with him regularly, keeping him updated on the progress of the investigation and the identification of victims. Each time a victim was identified and their family notified, Harmon made sure Miles knew, understanding that it was important for him to see the positive outcomes of the work he'd initiated. By the time the investigation concluded, a year after that initial call to Helen Duvall's house, they had identified 28 of the 31 victims, giving answers to families who'd spent years in agonizing uncertainty. 3 victims remained unidentified, their remains too degraded or their dental and DNA records non-existent or lost to time. They were buried in a community cemetery under a memorial that listed them as unknown but not forgotten, victims of Frank Burkhart. And Miles attended the ceremony, standing with a crowd of officers and community members who'd been affected by the case. Helen Duvall was there too, looking healthier than when Miles had last seen her, and she thanked him quietly for listening when she called about voices in her walls, for taking her fear seriously when it would have been easy to dismiss. As Miles drove home from the cemetery that day, he found himself thinking about all the voices that had been silenced by Frank Burkhart, all the women who'd died alone and terrified in hidden spaces, believing no one would ever find them. But they had been found. Their stories had been told, and their families had received closure. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. Burkhart had died unpunished, beyond the reach of the law, but it was something. It was recognition, remembrance, and a determination to ensure that what happened to them would never be forgotten. And for Miles, who'd spent months drowning in the darkness of the case, that small light of meaning was enough to help him find his way back to himself. 2 years after the discovery of the first bodies in Helen Duvall's house, Miles Corbett found himself standing outside a newly constructed memorial park on the site where the Duvall house had once stood. The county had demolished the house as planned, removed all contaminated soil, and decided to create a small park dedicated to the victims of Frank Burkhart. It was a quiet space with walking paths, benches, and a central monument listing the names of all the identified victims. The 3 who remained unknown were listed simply as Jane Doe, 1967, Jane Doe, 1973, and Jane Doe, 1981, the years representing the best estimates of when they'd died based on forensic analysis. Miles had been promoted to detective 6 months earlier, a recognition of his work on the Burkhart case and his dedication to seeing it through despite the personal cost. He worked in the Criminal Investigation Division now, partnering occasionally with Detective Harmon on cases that required multiple investigators. The work was different from patrol, more time spent reviewing evidence and conducting interviews, less time responding to immediate crises, but Miles found he was good at it. The attention to detail that had led him to notice the inconsistencies in the Duvall house served him well as an investigator, and he'd already cleared several cold cases that had languished in the files for years. But the Burkhart case stayed with him in ways that other investigations didn't. It had become a defining moment in his career and his life, the case that changed how he understood evil, and the capacity for ordinary-seeming people to commit extraordinary horrors. Miles came to the memorial park regularly, finding something peaceful in the quiet space, and he wasn't alone in that. Families of the victims visited frequently, leaving flowers and photographs and small mementos, creating a living tribute to the women who'd been stolen from them decades earlier. On this particular afternoon, Miles was meeting someone he hadn't seen since the early days of the investigation, Helen Duvall. She'd reached out through the department, saying she wanted to talk with Miles about something she'd been experiencing, and they'd agreed to meet at the memorial park. When Helen arrived, Miles was struck by how different she looked from the terrified woman he'd met that night 2 years ago. She seemed calmer, more grounded, though there was still a shadow behind her eyes that suggested the trauma hadn't fully released its hold on her. They walked the paths together, making small talk about Helen's life since leaving the house. She'd completed intensive therapy and was working again, teaching art at a community college in Conway. Her son had graduated and was working in Dallas, and Helen visited him regularly, grateful for the distance from Arkansas and the memories it held. But as they walked, Miles could sense that Helen had something specific she wanted to discuss, something that was weighing on her. Finally, as they sat on a bench near the central monument, Helen spoke about what had brought her here. "I still hear them sometimes," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the list of names carved into the granite. The voices. Not as loud as they were in the house, and not every night, but they're still there. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear whispers, women calling out names I don't recognize. My therapist says it's a form of PTSD, that my brain is processing the trauma by recreating the auditory experience. But Miles, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like they're actually trying to communicate something. Miles listened carefully, remembering his own experiences in the house and the period afterward when he'd been plagued by nightmares and intrusive thoughts. "What do they say?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral and professional. Helen pulled a small notebook from her purse and opened it to show pages filled with names and dates, all written in her precise handwriting. "I've been keeping track. Every time I hear the voices clearly enough to make out words, I write down what they say. Most of it is fragmentary, just names or phrases. But there's a pattern, and I think it might be important." Miles took the notebook and studied the entries, his detective's mind immediately looking for connections and consistencies. The names Helen had written down didn't match any of the identified Burkhart victims, and the dates ranged from the 1970s through the early 2000s, extending well beyond the timeline they'd established for Burkhart's activities. "Helen, have you shown this to anyone else? To Detective Harmon or any of the investigators?" Helen shook her head. "I was afraid they'd think I was losing my mind. But you were there that first night. You heard the voices too. I thought maybe you'd understand that there's something real happening, even if we can't explain it conventionally." Miles considered this carefully, weighing his professional obligation to report potentially relevant information against his concern for Helen's mental health and his own uncertainty about what the voices might represent. "I need to be honest with you, Helen. This could be psychological, a manifestation of trauma, but it could also be something we need to investigate. Would you be willing to let me look into these names, see if they connect to any missing person cases or unsolved crimes? I won't promise results, but I can at least check whether there's any objective basis for what you're experiencing." Helen agreed readily, seeming relieved to have someone take her seriously, and Miles took photographs of each page in the notebook with his phone. After Helen left, Miles sat alone at the memorial for a while, looking at the names carved in stone and thinking about the nature of memory and trauma and justice. He'd spent 2 years trying to move past the Burkhart case, to process it and file it away as a closed investigation, but now it seemed the case wasn't quite finished with him yet. Back at the station, Miles began running the names from Helen's notebook through various databases: missing persons, cold cases, unidentified remains. The work was tedious and time-consuming, and for the first several hours, he found nothing that connected to the names Helen had written down. But then he hit on something that made him sit up straighter in his chair. One of the names, Patricia Brennan, 1979, matched a missing person case from Hot Springs, Arkansas. Patricia had been a 19-year-old college student who'd disappeared while hitchhiking home for summer break, her case never solved. Miles pulled the full case file and read through the details. Patricia had last been seen getting into a vehicle described by witnesses as a dark-colored pickup truck on Highway 7 just outside Hot Springs. There were no solid leads, no suspects, and the case had gone cold within months. But what caught Miles's attention was a detail in the witness statements. One person had reported seeing the pickup truck turn onto a side road that led to a residential area under construction in 1979. That area, Miles discovered after checking historical records, was one of several developments where Frank Burkhart had been contracted to do the carpentry work. Over the next week, Miles worked through the rest of the names in Helen's notebook and found 6 more that matched unsolved missing person cases from the 1970s and 80s. All women, all last seen in areas where Burkhart had been working construction jobs. These cases had never been connected to the Burkhart investigation because they occurred in different jurisdictions and the victims had disappeared from locations far from the houses where the bodies were found. But if Helen's voices were somehow providing accurate information, it suggested that Burkhart's victim count was even higher than they'd established, and that there were still bodies hidden in locations they hadn't discovered. Miles took his findings to Detective Harmon, who was simultaneously intrigued and skeptical. "I don't know how to explain where Helen's getting this information," Harmon said, studying the connections Miles had mapped out. "If it's coming from her subconscious, that suggests she's somehow processing information about these cases that she shouldn't have access to. If it's something else..." She paused, unwilling to voice the more supernatural explanation. "Then we have to decide whether to pursue leads based on sources we can't explain in court." They ultimately decided to investigate quietly, following up on the connections Miles had found without publicizing the source of the leads. Harmon contacted the jurisdictions where the missing women had last been seen, and requested information about any construction projects Burkhart had been involved with in those areas. Over the following months, they identified 3 additional properties that Burkhart had worked on, all of them houses that had been torn down or extensively renovated in the decades since he'd been there. The properties were excavated carefully, and 2 of them yielded remains, sets of bones buried in what had been crawl spaces or basement areas, hidden beneath concrete or soil. The remains were identified through DNA and dental records as 2 of the women Helen had named in her notebook, Patricia Brennan and a woman named Susan Hartley, who'd disappeared in 1983. The discoveries validated Helen's information in ways that made even the most skeptical investigators uncomfortable. There was no rational explanation for how Helen could have known these names or their connection to Burkhart. No way she could have researched cases from jurisdictions across the state and connected them to a killer whose crimes were only discovered after she'd already started hearing the voices. Miles found himself thinking more and more about the nature of what they were dealing with. He'd seen the scratched messages in the walls, the desperate pleas for help that the victims had carved with their fingernails as they died. Those messages had been physical, tangible evidence that could be photographed and analyzed. But what if the trauma of those deaths had created something that persisted beyond the physical? What if the victims' need to be found, to have their stories told, had somehow imprinted itself on a wavelength that people like Helen could perceive under certain conditions? Detective Harmon was less comfortable with these metaphysical speculations, preferring to focus on the tangible investigative work. But even she had to acknowledge that the case was forcing them all to reconsider their assumptions about what was possible. "Maybe we've been thinking about this wrong," she said to Miles one evening as they reviewed the latest findings. "We've been treating the voices as either psychological phenomena or supernatural occurrences. But what if there's something else entirely? What if extreme trauma creates some kind of residual effect that can be detected by certain people? Not ghosts or spirits in the traditional sense, but echoes of suffering that persist in physical spaces." They never reached a definitive conclusion about the nature of the voices, and officially, the investigation continued to treat Helen's information as coming from confidential sources rather than trying to explain the unexplainable. But the discoveries continued. Over the next year, they found 4 more sets of remains based on information that Helen provided, bringing the total confirmed victim count to 37. The FBI became involved. Recognizing that Burkhart's crimes spanned multiple states and jurisdictions, and a federal task force was created to investigate the full scope of his activities. Miles was offered a position on the federal task force, but he declined, feeling that he'd already given as much of himself to the Burkhart case as he could without losing himself completely. He continued working as a detective in the local criminal investigation division, handling a variety of cases and trying to maintain the healthy boundaries he'd established through therapy. But he stayed in contact with Helen, checking in with her regularly and serving as the liaison between her and the ongoing investigation. Helen's mental health improved gradually as more victims were identified and their families received closure. She told Miles that the voices had become less frequent and less urgent, as if each discovery brought some measure of peace to the women whose stories were being told. But there were still names in Helen's notebook that they hadn't been able to connect to specific cases, and Helen reported that those voices were the loudest, the most insistent, as if the unidentified victims were calling out with increasing desperation. 3 years after the initial discovery, Miles received a call from Helen late one night. She sounded frightened, more distressed than he'd heard her since that first night in her house. "Miles, you need to come to the park. The Memorial Park. Something's happening." Miles didn't hesitate. Driving immediately to the site where the Duval house had once stood, he found Helen sitting on the ground near the central monument, her face pale in the streetlight. And as Miles approached, he heard it too. Voices, faint but distinct, coming from all around them. Not from any specific direction, but from the ground itself, from the air, from the monument with its list of names. Multiple voices, overlapping and echoing, speaking names and dates and locations. Miles pulled out his phone and started recording, capturing audio that would later be analyzed by specialists who'd find no rational explanation for the sounds. The voices continued for nearly 15 minutes, and Miles and Helen sat together listening, writing down everything they could make out clearly. When the voices finally faded, Miles and Helen compared notes. They'd both heard the same names, the same dates, the same desperate pleas for help. But what disturbed Miles most was something he heard in the final moments before the voices stopped. Clear and distinct above all the others, he heard a woman's voice say, "Thank you for listening. Thank you for finding us. But there are more." He wasn't the only one. There are always more. Miles felt a chill run through him as he processed those words. The implication was terrifying. That Frank Burkhart hadn't been unique. That there were other predators operating with similar methods, creating their own hidden spaces and collecting their own victims. And if that was true, then the work of finding and identifying victims would never truly be finished. Would continue indefinitely as long as there were people willing to exploit the vulnerable and hide their crimes behind suburban normalcy. Over the following weeks, Miles worked with the federal task force to investigate whether Burkhart had been part of a larger network or had inspired imitators. They found no direct evidence of coordination with other killers, but they did identify several unsolved cases across the country that shared similar characteristics. Hidden spaces in residential properties, victims sealed into walls or cavities, construction workers or contractors who'd had access to the properties during building or renovation. The pattern suggested that Burkhart's methods might have been used by others, either independently conceived or copied from news reports about his crimes. The investigation expanded further, growing beyond what any single agency could handle, and ultimately became an ongoing operation coordinated by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Miles continued to contribute when asked, providing insights from the original investigation and serving as a consultant on cases that involved hidden spaces or construction-related concealment. But he also worked to maintain distance, to avoid becoming so consumed by the darkness that he lost sight of everything else in his life. Delilah remained a constant presence, checking in on Miles regularly and pulling him back from the edge when she saw him getting too deep into the work. She'd been promoted to supervisor of the dispatch center and had helped implement new protocols for handling calls about strange sounds or voices in residential properties, ensuring that such calls were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. The Burkhart case had changed how the department approached these situations, recognizing that sometimes what seemed like paranoid concerns or supernatural fears could be signs of something genuinely dangerous hidden just out of sight. 5 years after that first call to Helen Duvall's house, Miles found himself back at the Memorial Park for an anniversary ceremony honoring the victims. The park had grown over the years, with additional monuments added as more victims were identified, and it had become a place of pilgrimage for families of missing persons and advocates working on cold cases. Helen was there, looking healthier and more at peace than Miles had ever seen her, and she told him that the voices had finally stopped completely 6 months earlier, after the last of the victims she'd heard had been identified and their families notified. "I think they just needed to be heard," Helen said, standing before the monument and reading the names carved in stone. "They needed someone to listen, to take their suffering seriously, to refuse to let them be forgotten, and now they can rest." Miles wanted to believe that, wanted to think that there was some measure of peace for the victims whose voices had echoed through the years, demanding justice that came too late to save them, but just in time to give their families closure. But Miles also thought about those final words he'd heard that night in the park, the warning that there were always more victims waiting to be found. He knew that somewhere in quiet suburban neighborhoods across the country, there were likely hidden spaces containing the remains of people who'd disappeared without a trace, their families still waiting for answers that might never come. And he knew that as long as he wore the badge, as long as he had the skills and the knowledge to investigate these cases, he had an obligation to keep looking, to keep listening, to refuse to let those voices fall silent. As Miles drove home from the ceremony that evening, his radio crackled with a dispatch call for a welfare check on an elderly resident who hadn't been seen in several days. The address was in an older subdivision, houses built in the 70s, and Miles felt that familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he responded to calls in those neighborhoods. He acknowledged the dispatch and turned toward the address, and as he drove through the quiet streets with their well-maintained lawns and normal-looking houses, he found himself listening, not just with his ears, but with that part of himself that the Burkhart case had awakened, the awareness that beneath the surface of suburban normalcy, terrible things could be hidden for years or decades, waiting for someone to finally hear the voices calling out from behind the walls. Miles pulled up to the address and sat in his vehicle for a moment, preparing himself for whatever he might find. He thought about all the victims who'd been silenced, all the families who'd suffered not knowing, and all the investigators who'd worked tirelessly to give them answers. And he thought about Helen, who'd had the courage to call 911 about voices that others might have dismissed, and whose willingness to be seen as crazy had ultimately led to justice for 37 women and ongoing investigations that might save countless more. As Miles walked toward the house, his hand resting instinctively on his radio, he made a silent promise to all the voices he'd heard, all the victims he'd helped identify, and all the families he'd given closure. He would keep listening. He would keep investigating. And he would never stop believing that every call, every complaint, every report of something unusual or frightening deserved to be taken seriously, because somewhere behind those walls, someone might be waiting for help that was 50 years too late, but still desperately needed. The house before him was quiet and still, its windows dark, its secrets hidden. Miles knocked on the door and called out his identification, and as he waited for a response, he could have sworn he heard something. Not a voice exactly, but a whisper on the wind, a sigh from the structure itself. Or maybe it was just his imagination, his mind primed by years of investigating horrors hidden in plain sight. Either way, Miles was listening, and he would continue to listen for as long as he wore the badge and carried the responsibility of responding when people called for help. Because in the end, that's what the job was really about. Not solving every case, or catching every criminal, or even understanding every inexplicable thing that happened in the course of human events. It was about showing up when called, taking people's fears seriously, and refusing to look away from darkness, even when it would be easier to dismiss it as imagination, or coincidence, or someone else's problem. Miles had learned that lesson in a suburban house in Arkansas, taught to him by voices scratched into walls and echoing through decades, and it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career and his life. The door opened slowly, and Miles stepped forward into whatever waited inside, his flashlight ready, his training solid, and his commitment to hearing the unheard stronger than ever.